Cole sprang up in the middle of dinner, hurling a glass of wine at the wall just inches from my daughter's face, then shoved Rachel down into her chair and slapped her over and over right in front of me. Before I could react, his mother, Veronica, slowly clapped her hands as if applauding a brilliant performance and said coldly, "My son finally knows how to teach his wife." In that moment, my blood froze. But while they thought I was in shock, I quietly switched on the recording mode inside my coat pocket. And they had no idea. Tonight wouldn't just end Rachel's marriage. It would unearth a family secret buried for 12 years and pull all of us into a war no one could have predicted. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I don't even remember how I got up from that heavy wooden chair. Everything in the dining room seemed to spin. The soft yellow ceiling lights, the expensive curtains, the smell of roasted meat and wine, all of it blended into a suffocating haze that forced me to take a deep breath just to keep from collapsing. I had seen plenty of violence in my years as an attorney, but never, not once, did I imagine witnessing my own daughter being slapped by her husband right before my eyes. And even less could I imagine an older woman like Veronica, a mother, a widow, clapping her hands in approval. Rachel was still dazed, her eyes red, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Her hair was a tangled mess from being yanked. I could hear her shallow, shaky breaths, as if one more gasp would break her body entirely. I forced myself to stay calm. If I spiraled, they would win. If I let emotion lead, I would miss the details I needed. I had coached countless clients through their worst moments, and now that same advice returned to save me. Slowly, clearly, I said, "Rachel, stand up, we're leaving." Cole laughed as if I had told a dull joke. Veronica tilted her head, a sick delight gleaming in her eyes. "You think you can take her that easily?" she asked, voice dripping with challenge. I didn't answer. I simply placed my hand on Rachel's shoulder and pried Cole's fingers off. He didn't resist. Perhaps he thought I was just a 62-year-old woman not worth his energy. But he would learn, very soon, that he had laid a hand on the only child of a mother who would burn the whole world down if necessary. I guided Rachel out of that massive house, the same place I had once believed would be her safe haven. I remembered Veronica's words at the wedding. Our family always welcomes her. Looking back, it sounded more like a warning than a promise. As we stepped outside, Rachel leaned on me like a woman drained after battle. The cold air bit at our faces, our breath turning into white mist. I helped her into the car, shut the door gently, then hurried around to the driver's side. The moment the door closed, Rachel collapsed into sobs like a child. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't want you to see that." Her voice was fractured, trembling as if every word caused physical pain. I cupped her face and whispered, "No, Rachel, you did nothing wrong. No woman is ever at fault for being hit." She clung to me, her tears soaking into my thick winter coat. I let her cry, let the fear she'd bottled up for so long finally spill out. But I knew comfort wasn't enough. I needed to get her away. Fast. We'd only driven a few minutes when Rachel gasped and spoke through broken breaths. "Mom, this wasn't the first time." I slammed on the brakes so hard the car nearly skidded on the frozen road. I turned to her, my heart seizing. "Cole has done this before? For how long?" She lowered her head. 3 years. Since the first year we got married. It took me several seconds to absorb that number. 3 years. 3 years she lived in fear, controlled, belittled, beaten, while pretending everything was fine. I felt rage shake my fingertips, but I didn't let myself explode. Not yet. I inhaled deeply, pulled the car over, and grabbed my phone. Yes, this is Linda Harrington. I need to report domestic violence. The victim is my daughter. My voice was steady, unshaken. When the police arrived, Veronica was already on the porch as if performing her daily script. I heard her tell an officer, "Rachel has mental issues. She's sensitive. She knocked over the glass herself and fell." I stood less than 7 feet away, stunned by how effortlessly she lied. Cole loomed behind her, feigning drunkenness, though I knew he was sober. An officer tried speaking to Rachel, but she was trembling too hard to answer. I stepped forward and handed him my phone. "Officer, I have evidence." Veronica shot me a razor-sharp look. She hissed, just loud enough for me to hear, "You're making a very big mistake, Linda." But I said only, "We'll see who's mistaken." Lieutenant Parker, someone I knew from past cases before I retired, listened intently to the recording. His face tightened at Veronica's "teach his wife" comment, then shifted toward Rachel's bruised cheek. He didn't say much. He just documented everything and instructed me to keep Rachel safe. "Linda, this case won't be easy," he murmured. "The Matthews family has influence, but hold on to every piece of evidence. I'll be in touch." I nodded. As the police left, Veronica gave me one last chilling stare. "You have no idea what my family can do." I didn't respond. I just held Rachel's hand and led her to the car. But inside, I knew. She wasn't lying. The Matthews family would strike back, and they wouldn't be gentle. That night, after Rachel fell asleep in her old high school bedroom, I sat alone in the kitchen. My small home in Columbus, Ohio, had never felt so silent. The clock ticked, and I stared at a pot of boiling water, forgetting to turn off the stove. I glanced at Rachel's sleeping face, still swollen and bruised. The sight hurt so deeply it felt physical. Quietly, I whispered, "I will tear that family apart if I have to." I knew I had entered a lopsided war, a single mother against a wealthy, powerful family with a dark past, but I also knew I had no way back. When I replayed the recording, I heard the line Veronica muttered, thinking I was far enough not to hear. "Just like I did with my husband back then." A chill ran down my spine. I realized I had stumbled onto something far bigger than domestic violence, something that could destroy the entire Matthews empire. And more importantly, this door, once opened, could never be shut again. I sat in that kitchen for nearly an hour after the recording ended, my hands still trembling. Her words rang in my ears like cold metal scraping. Just like I did with my husband back then. Abusers sometimes speak nonsense in anger, but Veronica, she wasn't the type to say anything without calculation. She measured every glance, every breath, which made those words heavier, denser, and far more dangerous. The next morning, when Rachel walked downstairs, I saw the change immediately, in her posture, in her eyes. She no longer looked like a woman pretending to be strong. She looked hollow, like someone who survived the storm but wasn't sure she'd survive the sunrise. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered. I pulled out a chair and placed a cup of tea before her, softening my voice. "Rachel, you need to tell me everything. All of it." She stayed quiet for a long time. Not until the steam from her tea rose and her eyes brimmed with tears did she finally speak. "Veronica." "She was always there, Mom." "Always." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "During the first week after the wedding, she gave Cole a plan, a marriage plan. You heard me right. It had a timeline for having kids, how to manage finances, who got to make decisions. Cole treated it like scripture. She ran a hand through her hair, exhaling shakily. She asked me to send her my pay stub every month so she could help us manage things. When I refused, she said I was disrespecting their family. Heat flooded my face. Veronica wasn't just controlling, she was a seasoned manipulator. Rachel continued, her voice flat as if she had rehearsed these thoughts 100 times alone. Cole started telling me to drop friends, said they were bad influences. Then he criticized my job at the lab, said it had no future. I believed him. I thought he wanted what was best for me. That was when I knew. Rachel had been eroded mentally, little by little. Abusers rarely start with violence. They start by shrinking their victim, piece by piece. I squeezed her hand. You are not to blame, not even a little. Rachel bit her lip, eyes wet. I knew what came next would be the hardest part, but truth was necessary. Once Rachel was steady enough, I went into my small office, opened my laptop, and created the first file. Case file. Rachel. Harrington Matthews. I hadn't practiced law formally in years, but my instincts were sharp as ever. I titled the document and began listing everything. Visible injuries, exact dates and times. Witness myself. Photos. I took pictures of every bruise, every swollen mark. Audio evidence. The original recording and one backup. My fingers flew across the keyboard, not sloppy, just fast. Every keystroke felt like a vow. Veronica Matthews would not erase this truth. As I was reviewing the timestamps, my phone rang. Veronica's name appeared. I let it ring a few seconds before picking up. I didn't want her thinking I was waiting. Linda, she began, her voice sugar-sweet enough to make my skin crawl. We're both adults. I believe we can resolve this. Gently. What do you want? I asked flatly. I want to protect your daughter, she said, stretching each word as if offering charity. Rachel isn't suitable for our family. She's weak, emotional, and Cole, he's simply stressed. If you insist on escalating this, we will have to reveal some unflattering things about Rachel. I let out a thin, humorless laugh. Are you threatening me? I'm not threatening, she replied lightly, as if discussing living room decor. I'm warning you. Once my family acts, Rachel won't just lose her husband, she'll lose her job, her reputation, her chances at a normal life. I don't want that for her, but if you push me, I'll have no choice. My voice was calm, calmer than I expected. You might want to be careful, Veronica. I'm recording this call. Silence. Then she hung up. That silence was more terrifying than any threat. Later that afternoon, Lieutenant Parker called. Rachel needs to come in to give a statement. Without it, we can't move forward. Rachel stood beside me, hearing every word, her face drained of color. Mom, if work finds out, they'll judge me. The lab is downsizing. I can't lose my job. I held her shoulders gently. Don't worry about losing a job. Worry about keeping your life and taking your freedom back. But I knew that when a woman's spirit has been worn down for years, logic can't overpower fear. Rachel wasn't just afraid of Cole. She was afraid the world would turn its back on her the way Veronica had taught her from the start. No one will believe you. That invisible pressure kills confidence faster than any slap. That evening, after Rachel went upstairs to rest, I heard a car stop in front of the house. I opened the door and saw Veronica standing there in her expensive fur coat, her face calm as if she were visiting a neighbor. I warned you, Linda, she said bluntly. You're ruining that girl's life. My son just needs time. Rachel is fragile. She imagines things. I folded my arms. "What do you want here?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "My husband did not die of a heart condition." The word sliced through the air like a blade. I stood silent for several seconds, forcing myself not to react. Veronica gave a thin smile. He hurt himself with foolish decisions. Sometimes, women like us must protect our families at any cost, understand? "I didn't kill my husband," I said, "and I don't encourage anyone to do that." "Not everyone has the luxury of such morals, Linda," she replied. "My family survives because of difficult decisions." Then she left, the cold wind swirling behind her, as if the ground under my feet had cracked open. Rachel heard the last part of the conversation as she came down the stairs. She burst into tears, clinging to my shoulders. "Mom, I dragged you into all of this. I'm sorry." I placed my hand on her hair and stroked gently. "Don't apologize. I chose to stand with you, and I'm not backing down." But I knew I needed to prepare, truly prepare. That very night, I sent copies of the dinner recording, the phone call with Veronica, and my preliminary documents to an old colleague, Nora Campbell, now a federal prosecutor. I wrote only, "If anything happens to me, release all of this to the press." Nora replied immediately, "Understood. Stay safe." When Rachel fell asleep again, I opened my laptop and began researching the Matthews name. I didn't know what I was looking for, but my instincts told me this wasn't just about domestic violence, and I was right. Page after page, document after document, murky charity networks, unusually large political donations, missing pages from Thomas Matthews's medical file 12 years ago. The more I read, the more I felt as though someone was standing right behind me. The darkness around this story wasn't just thick, it moved, and I understood. We weren't just fighting a controlling family. We were touching a deep pit that people had tried to bury for more than a decade. I stared at my laptop until my eyes burned, unable to look away. The documents I unearthed about the Matthews family chilled me, even though the kitchen still held the warmth of the earlier tea. Everything I had suspected about Veronica, her cruelty, her control, her coldness, was only the surface. What I was seeing now went far beyond anything I had braced myself for. The name Matthew Matthews, Veronica's late husband, appeared in the death records like a shadow no one had mentioned in years. A familiar face from old community work more than a decade ago, then suddenly gone. I remembered seeing his picture at Cole's house. A gentle middle-aged man with a strained smile, like someone trying to hide relentless exhaustion. I hadn't thought much of it then. But now... I opened the forensic report. The first line made me press a hand over my mouth to keep my breath from escaping. Multiple contusions inconsistent with accidental fall. Multiple bruises not consistent with a bathroom slip. Not one, not two. More than 8 bruises, in places no simple fall could cause. On his back, his arms, his lower abdomen. Half-moon shapes like someone's knuckles had left the marks. None of this appeared in the report Veronica presented at the funeral. I swallowed hard. The next lines were like a knife cutting through the silence. Possible signs of struggle, signs of resistance. I closed my eyes for a second, then forced them open. I needed to stay sharp for Rachel. A handwritten note from the responding officer was attached. One line made my skin crawl. Neighbor reports loud argument night before death. Woman shouting, thuds. A major fight, followed by a death-ruled accidental bathroom fall. And the person who benefited most financially was Veronica. I read on. Widow requested immediate cremation. Refused second examination. I pressed a hand to my forehead, trying not to tremble. Pieces were falling into place in a terrifying pattern. She controlled her family, controlled her son, controlled her husband's estate, and now she wanted to control Rachel's future, if I allowed it. I remembered the way Cole stiffened every time Veronica entered the room. His body went rigid, lips pressed tight, like a child caught doing wrong. Grown men don't fear their mothers like that, unless that control had been carved into their bones. Maybe that was why Cole believed controlling Rachel was normal. He was raised inside a cage, and men raised in cages rarely learn how to love. But understanding does not mean forgiving. I closed the laptop, stood, and gathered the entire stack of documents. I knew exactly what I had to do. Lieutenant Parker opened the door when I knocked. His face was tired, lined with years of long cases, but his eyes were still sharp, the eyes of a man who lived by principle and didn't bow to power. "I expected you to call in the morning," he said, letting me in. I couldn't wait. I placed the documents on his desk. "You need to see this right now." He read carefully, page by page. His jaw tightened. When he reached the neighbor's statement, he set the papers down and looked up. "Linda, do you know what you're stepping into?" "I do." "The Matthews family. They're not easy to take on. And Veronica is not just a controlling mother. She may be a killer." He was silent for several seconds, then said, "I'll open an independent investigation. We'll need witnesses, forensic review, and I'll find a way," I interrupted. "Just don't let them bury this." He nodded. "I promise." That promise meant more to me than anything. When I got home, Rachel sat at the dining table, her hands holding her head. The warm light softened her face, making her look younger, more fragile. She looked up. "Mom, where did you go? I was scared." I sat beside her and held her hand tightly. "Rachel, I need you to be strong. This goes deeper than we thought." She blinked, trying to read my expression. "Did you find something?" I told her everything, every word like shards of glass slicing the air. When I reached the part about signs of struggle, Rachel shivered as if someone had plunged her into ice water. No way, Mom, she couldn't have. She couldn't finish. I pulled her into my arms as her breathing grew unsteady. "Listen to me," I whispered, stroking her back. "We cannot be afraid. The truth is the only thing that will get you out of that family." But Rachel shook her head repeatedly, panicked. "Mom, if she killed her husband, she could kill us. She has power, money, people protecting her." I held her shoulders firmly, forcing her to meet my eyes. "Remember last night? You almost died under Cole's hands. If we back down now, you'll never escape. I would rather die than see you go back into that house." She broke down, sobbing into my shoulder. I slept only a few hours before dawn broke. As I was preparing tea, I heard a car stop outside. My heart jumped. Veronica again? But no, this car was black, with no Matthews family plate. The mail carrier left a thin envelope. No sender. I opened it. Inside was a small black USB and a single note. "You need to hear this if you want to stay alive." My chest tightened. I didn't plug the USB into my main laptop. I used an old offline computer. The audio began to play, and I froze. The voice I recognized instantly. Veronica, calm, cold, not a tremor of guilt, as if she were describing a flower arrangement. "He deserved to die. Long ago, I only gave him a little push. Men sometimes need to be reminded who runs things." I covered my mouth to stifle my breath. Rachel had come halfway down the stairs, heard me, and approached. "Mom, what is it?" I didn't answer. I handed her the headphones, and when she heard, "I only gave him a little push," her knees buckled beneath her. "Mom, she killed him. She really did." I caught her before she hit the floor. "This is the evidence we needed, the only weapon strong enough to make her pay." But I knew, right then and there, we had crossed a line we could never return from. Veronica was no longer just an emotional abuser, no longer just the mother of a violent man. She was a killer. And killers will do anything to bury the truth. I stared at the USB, then at my trembling daughter. I understood that from this moment forward, the darkness the Matthews family had hidden for over a decade had fully risen, and we, two lone women, stood at the center of the storm. I gently stroked Rachel's shoulder as she sat on the floor, staring at the USB like it was a venomous snake. I knew she was trying to grasp how someone could say such things and still live a polished public life, attending charity events and smiling for cameras. But I understood. I had met people like her in my career, powerful individuals with two faces, one for the world and one for the unfortunate souls trapped with them. But Veronica was unlike anyone I had ever confronted. She felt like a thinking shadow, one that chose its moment to strike, and I knew she wouldn't sit still. Just 2 days after we received the USB, the counterattack began, swift, cold, and precise as a blade across the throat. That morning, as I was preparing breakfast, the doorbell rang. Rachel answered, and I heard a man's voice say, "Rachel Harrington, this is a summons. You are accused of providing false information in a domestic violence report." Rachel froze, her hands shaking so badly the paper nearly slipped from her fingers. I rushed over and took it from her. The words on the legal document seemed to dance before my eyes. "False reporting, fabrication of domestic violence incident." I inhaled deeply, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "This is intimidation, Rachel. Don't panic." But her eyes were filled with panic. "Mom, they're saying I made it up. They want to turn me into a criminal." I pulled her into my arms. "I'm here. We'll handle this." But not even 2 hours later, the second wave of the storm hit. Rachel's phone rang. I stood beside her as she put the call on speaker. "Miss Harrington, this is Human Resources. Due to the current situation affecting the company's reputation, we regret to inform you that we must place you on temporary suspension, pending an internal review." Rachel's face went pale. "But I'm the victim. I didn't do anything wrong." "We understand, but the company must protect its image. Thank you for your understanding." The call ended. Rachel dropped the phone onto the table, covering her head with both hands as if trying to keep the world from collapsing. "I'm going to lose my job," she whispered. "No, you're not," I said, though my chest felt heavy as stone. "They're just playing dirty." I had never seen my daughter look as small as she did in that moment. The next day, while I was working in my small office, an old room in a 2-story building next to the city library, 3 men in suits walked in. "IRS, we're here for an immediate inspection." My heart sank. "Do you have a warrant?" They did, complete and legal. They tore apart everything, files, computers, even my personal cabinet. In 32 years of practicing law, I had never once been audited in such a brutal manner. They hauled out boxes filled with documents. I knew exactly where this came from. The IRS does not suddenly care about a small attorney like me. Rachel texted me, "Mom, are you okay?" They came to my workplace too. I replied, "I'm fine. Don't worry. This is Veronica's move." I typed it like a cold fact, but my hands were shaking so badly the letters warped. That night, I received an email from the Ohio Bar Association. Complaint received. Ms. Harrington is suspected of abusing her authority and improperly influencing a criminal investigation. I froze. Who filed the complaint? I didn't need to ask. Veronica had begun turning over every weapon she had. This was no longer a personal dispute. This was a war designed to destroy my career, my reputation, and my spirit. While I fought the silent attacks, Rachel faced something even crueler. Her friends, the ones who took wedding photos with her, attended every birthday, said they loved her like a sister, began pulling away. I heard a voicemail playing on Rachel's phone as I walked into the living room. "Rachel, I really don't understand what you're doing. Cole is a good man. You're ruining his career. We don't want to be dragged into this drama. Please don't contact us anymore." Rachel shut off the phone mid-message. "I don't have anyone left, Mom. They all believe him." I held her hand. "It's okay. You still have me." But I knew for someone young like Rachel, losing friends could hurt even more than losing a job. Veronica didn't stop there. Saturday morning, while I was taking Rachel for additional injury documentation, a post went viral online. A worthless gold digger used Cole to latch onto money and turned on him when it didn't work out. Failed at her job, so she fabricated abuse for a payout. The account posting it? Veronica Matthews, a woman in her 70s using social media like a sharpened weapon. Rachel cried right there in the car, "Mom, I'm done. I can't take this anymore." I cupped her cheek. "Rachel, this is exactly what they want, to break you so you give up." She had lost weight. Her eyes were sunken. Her hair was thinning from the stress. This wasn't just external pressure. It was a battle inside her own soul. And I understood then. The Matthews family didn't want to destroy her reputation. They wanted to destroy her belief in herself. The next day, I met with Lieutenant Parker at the station. He looked at me with a rare expression of sympathy. "Linda, I'll be honest," he said, handing me a cup of hot coffee. "The Matthews family has deep connections in this city. You're dealing with something bigger than you think." "I know," I replied, "but I'm not withdrawing the report." He nodded. "I'll support you as much as I can within the boundaries of my job, but you need to prepare for more hits. This is just the opening act." I understood. I'd been in the field long enough to know that when the powerful are cornered, they strike back, by any means, legal or not. When I got home, I opened my laptop and began writing. Not legal briefs this time, but an event journal, documenting every threat, every call, every detail Veronica tried to bury. In my profession, when you fear being railroaded, there's only one way to survive: record everything. I wrote until the clock struck 3 a.m. I wrote until my hands hurt, until I heard Rachel crying softly in her room. When I finally set down my pen, I knew this was only beginning. Veronica had only used her left hand. She still had an entire arsenal waiting. I turned off the lights and stood at the window overlooking the dark yard. A cold wind shook the branches. I felt as though someone was watching us from the shadows. I took a deep breath, clenched my fist, and whispered, "If they want a war, I'll show them what a mother can do when her child is pushed to the edge." 'Cause I knew the real battle had only just begun. I still remember clearly the morning I decided to dig deeper into the death of Mr. Matthew Matthews. While making coffee, I opened the documents I'd photographed from the county's public records, the ones Veronica surely assumed the world had forgotten. But when I enlarged the scanned pages, something made my pulse tighten. There was mention of an old will, but not a single line about a newer one. That was far too strange for a man with his level of wealth. I called the county records office and asked casually, For the Matthew Matthews case, where is the 2011 will file? The person on the other end paused so long I thought the line had dropped. Ma'am, no will was ever filed. I knew that couldn't be true. A wealthy man active in the community dying suddenly would absolutely have left a will, at least a draft. But the file was blank, no trace, no copy. There was only one explanation. The will had been deliberately removed, and I didn't need 3 guesses to know who benefited most. That afternoon, I drove to a place I had long avoided, Maplewood Lake, where Mr. Matthews supposedly slipped and fell before losing consciousness. I stood before the still water, reflecting the gray sky, trying to imagine a healthy, middle-aged man simply losing his footing on such a harmless stretch of rocks. Nothing about the setting suggested danger, only silence. I didn't know how long I stood there before a voice behind me said, "What are you looking for out here?" I turned. A man in his 50s wearing a ranger uniform leaned against the wooden railing near the water. "I'm just trying to understand what happened here years ago," I said honestly. He studied me, then exhaled. "I remember him. Matthew Matthews. I was first on site after the call came in." I steadied myself. "Did you see anything unusual?" He bent and snapped a dry twig in half. "The night before," he said slowly, "I saw him and Mrs. Matthews arguing loudly, right there by the rocks." He pointed to the east side of the lake, very heated. She kept standing in his space, like she was cornering him. My heartbeat quickened. "Did you report that to police at the time?" He shook his head, eyes slipping away. "No one asked, and honestly, I didn't want trouble with a rich family." His words sent chills through me. People didn't stay silent because they didn't know. They stayed silent because they were afraid. When I returned home, Rachel was at the kitchen table, her laptop open, her eyes more alert than they had been in days. I saw a faint spark in her, a flicker I feared she had lost. "What are you working on?" Rachel turned the screen toward me. "I'm gathering emails and messages from Cole. Some have threats, and some I never dared read twice." I squeezed her hand, proud as if she had risen from a deep abyss. "You're doing well," I whispered. Rachel shook her head. "Not just that. I found something. You need to see." She opened a new folder. Inside were dozens of video files from security cameras, but not ones from her house. Cole installed hidden cameras in the house. I never knew until today when I accessed his cloud account. He forgot to change the password. I froze. "Rachel, how long were you being watched?" She opened a file dated last year, then another from 3 years prior. "I don't know," she said in despair, "but it looks like years." I covered my mouth, not from shock, but from choking fury. "You weren't just a victim of physical abuse," I said, steadying my voice. "You were a victim of illegal surveillance. This is a federal crime." Rachel inhaled sharply, tears streaming, but eyes no longer cast downward. "I want to fight, Mom." It was the first time she said the words herself, and her voice made me believe she wouldn't break. The next day, I brought everything to Lieutenant Parker, the old forensic report, the ranger's account, the anonymous letter, the USB, Cole's hidden cameras. After I finished presenting, he leaned back in his chair, hands clasped before his mouth. "Linda," he said gravely, "this is no longer a suspicion. This is a homicide case with clear signs of cover-up." I nodded. "I know. And I need you to understand, you're on the right path. But the closer you get to the truth, the more dangerous it becomes." I met his eyes steadily. "I accept that." Parker took a deep breath and turned on his recorder to formally begin assembling evidence. I knew at that moment everything had crossed into a threshold we could never return from. That night, while I was typing more entries into the event journal, a faint metallic sound echoed from the back door. Rachel was asleep. I walked quietly down the stairs. The porch light cast a dim orange glow across the kitchen tiles. The back door was ajar. My lungs tightened. "Hello," I called out, but no one answered. I turned on every light in the house, checking room by room, window by window. Nothing was missing. There were no signs of theft. Only a small piece of paper placed neatly on the kitchen counter. Only 3 words written in black marker: "Step back." I lost my breath for a few seconds. A coldness spread from the back of my neck down my spine, as if someone had placed a hand on my throat. But that fear didn't weaken me, it only made me angrier. The next morning, Rachel saw me installing an extra safety lock on the back door. "Did something happen, Mom?" I didn't lie. "They pried the door open last night, didn't take anything, just a warning." Rachel panicked and wrapped her arms around me. "Mom, we have to stop." I placed my hands on her cheeks. "Rachel, if I step back, who will save you? Who will stop them from doing this to someone else?" She froze, and in her eyes I saw fear and respect blending together. "Aren't you scared?" "Of course I'm scared," I said honestly, "but fear isn't a reason to give up." I called Parker and reported the incident. Just half an hour later, he arrived at my house with 2 other officers. After checking the signs of tampering, he said, "They want you to know they're watching you. This is classic pressure tactics." "I understand," I replied. "From now on," Parker said, "the 2 of you will have nighttime patrol surveillance, and I'll request special protective measures for you if the case moves forward." I didn't ask if. I asked, "When do we take the next step?" Parker looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Very soon, Linda. You're closer to the truth than anyone else has ever dared to get." I looked out the window. The sky had gone dark. The wind was strong, and the old oak tree in the yard leaned toward the house as if trying to warn us. I knew deep in my bones that Parker was right. The closer we got to the truth, the more desperate the Matthews family became. And desperate people, especially those with money and power, are the most dangerous of all. But I also knew this, as clearly as my own heartbeat. I wasn't fighting for justice anymore. I was fighting to save my daughter's soul, and for that reason, I would never step back. I have never forgotten the morning of the disciplinary hearing, a morning I knew the other side wanted to turn into a sentence hanging over my head to scare me into staying silent forever. The Ohio Bar Association headquarters always felt formal, but that day it felt larger, colder, full of watching eyes. I didn't tremble, but every muscle in my body felt stretched tight like a wire. When I walked into the wide room with long wooden benches and the counsel seated in front, I understood that even a small misstep could destroy my 32-year career. Rachel wanted to come with me, but I told her to stay home with Parker. I didn't want her to witness any more humiliation. I set my bag down and opened the notebook where I had recorded every incident, every threat, every shady move the Matthews family had made. I was prepared to defend myself to the end, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened when the back door of the room opened. An older man, tall and slender but slow in his steps, leaning on a dark wooden cane, walked in. Light from the window fell across his face, a face I felt I had seen before, half hidden in an old photograph. The man stopped in the center of the room, seemed to gather his breath, and spoke in a hoarse but firm voice. "I am Edward Matthews, brother of Matthew Matthews. I want to testify." The room went so silent I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. The council members turned to look at one another, then at me, as though wondering if this was something I had orchestrated. But I was more shocked than anyone. The name Matthews, that family name, was the very thing Veronica had always guarded like an impenetrable fortress. Edward Matthews slowly took a seat in the back row, bowing his head slightly toward me in a small gesture of greeting. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, but his eyes were bright and sharp, like someone who had carried a truth for too long. The chairperson spoke. "Mr. Matthews, please tell us why you are here today." The old man lifted his head. "Because I must make things right. I have been silent for 12 years. My heart skipped a beat. He began speaking slowly, as if each sentence dragged a painful memory with it. My sister-in-law, Veronica. She was smart, sharp, but after she married Matthew, I saw her change. She controlled the family, controlled the money, and especially controlled Matthew. My brother tried to separate from her 3 times, but each time, Veronica found a way to pull him back. The council exchanged glances. I listened to every word like swallowing ice. "I saw injuries on Matthew," he continued. "He lied, said he fell, hit a door, slipped off a ladder. But I knew because I once saw her shove him into a wall when she thought no one was watching." The council member frowned. "You're saying Veronica was physically violent?" Edward nodded, gripping his cane. "Not just that. She manipulated him psychologically. She made him believe that leaving her meant losing everything, his son, his company, his reputation, and she really had the means to make that true." I clenched my hands slightly as I listened, not surprised, not startled, just hearing the confirmation of what my instincts had long whispered. The night Matthew died. Edward took a long breath, his gaze drifting far away, back to Maplewood Lake that night. "He called me an hour before. He said he had found a lawyer and was going to file for divorce. He wanted to protect Cole. He wanted out." I held my breath. When I arrived, Veronica was on the porch. She coldly told me to go home. The next morning, Matthew was dead. She said it was an accident. "Did you believe it was an accident?" the chairperson asked. "From the moment I saw the bruises on Matthew's wrist at the funeral home," Edward said, voice shaking, "I knew it wasn't." Another member asked, "Then why did you stay silent for 12 years? Edward bowed his head, his shoulders trembling slightly. "Because Veronica threatened my family. She said if I opened my mouth, I would have nothing left in this world to hold on to. And when I looked into her eyes, I believed her." A painful weight rose in my chest, an elderly man carrying guilt, fear, and silence for more than a decade. Edward looked directly at me. "I sent you the USB. I recorded her conversation with someone she once hired as home help. I sent it to make amends. I knew she would do to your daughter what she did to my brother if you didn't act." A shiver ran through me. His appearance wasn't just a turning point, it was a testimony from someone who had run from the truth for far too long. The chairperson whispered to the council, then announced, "While these new details are verified, the disciplinary investigation against Ms. Harrington will be paused. We do not see evidence at this time that she abused her authority as alleged." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Not relief, just the ability to breathe again. When I opened them, Edward was watching me, his gray-brown eyes warm but sorrowful. I walked toward him. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice tight. "No one blames you." He shook his head. "Oh yes, I blame myself. But now I want to make things right. If you and that police officer can protect me, I'm willing to be an official witness." "I promise," I said, placing my hand on his wrist, feeling his bones fragile but strong. We will protect you." Edward pressed his lips together. Veronica won't sit still. I know. He studied me for a moment, then said, as gently as a breeze, "But you're stronger than you think, Linda. That's why I came today." When I stepped out of the hearing room, the air outside felt clearer, as if the sky had finally opened after days of storm clouds. But I knew this wasn't the end. This was only the silence before the storm. I stood on the steps, watching cars move along the avenue, and felt that something fundamental had shifted. Not just that we had more evidence or a new witness, but that I was no longer alone. A man who had carried 12 years of guilt had chosen to step into the light, and I knew that from the moment Edward Matthews walked into that room, the fortified world Veronica had built had begun to crack. When I got into my car and called Parker, he let out a stunned sigh. "Linda, you just brought us the biggest missing piece." "We have to protect him," I said. "I'll arrange it, but you need to be careful too. Once Veronica feels cornered, she'll be more dangerous than ever." I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, tired but steady. I'm ready. As I drove home, the late afternoon sun cast a soft gold across the road, making everything seem gentler. But inside me, a slow-burning fire spread, not anger anymore, but hope. For the first time since this battle began, I felt a real chance. And that feeling scared me, because as Parker had said and as life had taught me, when the powerful sense they're losing everything, they never go down quietly. Veronica Matthews must have felt the shift, and she would strike back. I just didn't know how, but I was ready. I still remember the moment Parker called, his voice heavy as if weighed down by stones. I was making chamomile tea for Rachel when the phone buzzed on the table. When I saw his name on the screen, I knew immediately something had happened, and I was right, but never imagined the extent. "Linda, you need to stay calm," Parker said. I'm used to hearing that. I tried to steady my voice. "What happened?" He paused. "Cole Matthews just violated the restraining order. Badly." I set the cup down, my heart pounding. "What did he do?" Parker exhaled. He broke into Rachel's old house, destroyed everything. The kitchen floor under my feet felt colder. Rachel wasn't there, right? "No, but you should prepare yourself for what he did." When we arrived at Rachel's old house, the police had already taped off the yard. I held her hand tightly as she walked in. I thought she had prepared herself, but no one could be prepared for the sight before us. The living room looked like a storm had torn through it. The sofa slashed open, wooden furniture smashed into pieces, family photos, pictures of Rachel as a child, pictures of the two of us on our first trip after my divorce, were thrown to the floor, glass shattered everywhere. The crystal glasses Cole once gave her for Christmas shattered. But the worst part wasn't the broken objects. It was the bedroom door. On it, painted in dark red like blood, were the words, "I will take back what's mine." Rachel staggered back as if someone had slapped her hard. I caught her before her legs gave out. "Cole used to be in this room every day," she whispered, "and now it looks like he wants to erase every trace of me." I held her close. "Sweetheart, nothing here belongs to you anymore. The things that truly belong to you, freedom, safety, and your future, are all ahead of you." She cried, but this time not the helpless sobbing of the past weeks. Tears fell, but her eyes were different, brighter. Something in her had broken, and something else had awakened. Parker came over and handed me his tablet. The neighbor's camera caught everything. He destroyed the house for nearly 3 hours straight. No mask, no attempt to hide. I watched each clip, every swing of his arm carving deeper into the truth. He wasn't just unstable, he had decayed. "Rachel," Parker said gently, "we've taken him into custody. He's in the holding facility now." She nodded, wiping her tears. "I want to see him," she said. I turned sharply. "No." But Parker looked at Rachel as if he understood something. Maybe that's exactly what she needs to end this. He was right. I had seen my daughter change. She was no longer the terrified woman from the months before. She needed to close this door herself, not with fear, but with her own voice. The city. Jail sat beside the old courthouse with cold concrete walls and pale neon lights. When Rachel stepped into the visitation room, I walked behind her, my hand resting lightly on her back. He was already sitting there, hands cuffed in front of him, his face tense, but his eyes still full of that arrogant confidence of a man who believed he was right. "Rachel," Cole said first, half relieved, half reproachful. "You came. I knew you would." "Not for the reason you think," Rachel replied, her voice small but solid as steel. I sat down next to my daughter but said nothing. This was her moment. Cole leaned forward, the cuffs clinking. "They're making all this up. Veronica is blowing things out of proportion. You know my mother, but I love you. You know that." Rachel looked at him for a long time, so calmly that it knocked the confidence out of Cole's eyes. "Cole, love never hurts," she said. He frowned. "What are you talking about? I did everything for you. I got angry because I love you. You've known that about me for years." Rachel shook her head. "No, you did it because you wanted control, because you thought I was your possession." Cole's face flushed red, his cuffed hands tightening. "I will get you back. I told you already. You belong to me." Rachel stood up, leaning down slightly so she could look him directly in the eyes. "That's why I came today. To tell you one thing." Cole held his breath. "I'm divorcing you." His whole body jerked. His eyes turned icy, like someone had thrown him into cold water. No, Rachel, you can't, you're not allowed." "I am allowed," Rachel said, soft but firm. "And I will." Cole slammed his hands on the table, the metal ringing sharply. "Rachel, that's not you. Someone is filling your head. I know you love me." "I used to think so," Rachel cut in. "But now I understand. Whatever that was, it wasn't love." There was a silence so heavy it felt like the air had hardened. Cole bent forward, breathing hard like a man who had missed a step in the dark. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Rachel added. "Thank you for that, because if you hadn't done all those terrible things, maybe I never would have seen myself clearly." I looked at my daughter, and I saw a new woman, someone who had walked out of ruins and stood on her own feet. Cole stared at us, his eyes red. He searched Rachel's face for something, hope, regret, a desire to come back, but there was nothing left for him. That was the last time they looked at each other as husband and wife. Rachel turned away first. I walked behind her, but before leaving, I looked at Cole one last time. He was hunched forward, his shoulders trembling, not from remorse, but from losing control. He no longer had any power over my daughter. When we stepped into the jail courtyard, the late afternoon sun slanted down, casting a warm golden band across Rachel's face. She tilted her head toward the sky, her eyes closing, as if for the first time in years she could breathe deeply, fully, without anyone choking the air out of her. "Mom," she said, "I feel like I just walked out of a locked room I'd been stuck in for too long." I held her hand and squeezed gently. "You didn't just walk out, Rachel. You closed the door on that darkness for good." She smiled. The first real smile since this all began. "I'm free," she whispered. I looked at her, my heart full of a deep gratitude I couldn't put into words. A chapter had closed, not just for Rachel, but for me too. Yet I knew one thing as clearly as I knew the red letters I once saw painted across my daughter's door. Rachel's freedom was only the beginning. The real fight was still coming. I always thought that when the day finally arrived, when the truth couldn't be buried anymore, I would feel relieved. But when I stepped into the courthouse for Cole's first hearing, what I felt wasn't victory. It was a fog, thick and cold, hanging over everything. The air felt tight, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Rachel sat beside me, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. But her face was calm, a calm only someone who has stared into the deepest dark and survived can possess. Cole was escorted in wearing an orange jumpsuit, nothing like the polished, confident man he once pretended to be. His posture was stiff, clumsy, like someone who wasn't used to no one opening doors for him anymore. When he saw Rachel, he froze. Just a moment, but enough for me to know he still didn't understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. The judge called the court to order. The hearing began. The prosecutor played the neighbor's camera footage. Cole smashing windows, breaking furniture with a hammer, ripping apart the bed, tearing wedding photos, destroying gifts Rachel once gave him. 3 hours of chaos, 3 hours of hatred, 3 hours of the twisted love he always claimed justified everything. The whole courtroom went silent when the footage reached the part where Cole painted the red words, "I will take back what's mine." I saw Rachel shiver. I placed my hand over hers. "You don't belong to his darkness anymore," I whispered. When the defense attorney tried to argue temporary emotional instability, the prosecutor shut it down immediately. There was a history of abuse, threatening messages, evidence from the hidden cameras. And most importantly, Cole violated the restraining order just 3 days after it was issued. The judge struck the gavel. His voice was sharp and final. "Defendant Cole Matthews, the court sentences you to 5 years in prison and a permanent no-contact order with the victim." Cole shot up from his seat. "Rachel, say something. You know I did it because I love you." Rachel didn't turn back. She said only one sentence, quiet but cutting through. "The air like glass." That wasn't love. Those words split the room in two. Cole sank into his chair, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was no arrogance left. Officers led him away. Veronica stood up, her eyes burning into me like she wanted to tear my skin apart. "You destroyed my family," she hissed. I didn't tremble. I didn't lash back. I simply said, "You did that long before I came." Her face flushed, but no one stood beside her. Not a single person. The hearing ended, but I knew it was only the first chapter of their collapse. 2 months later, early fall chilled the air in Ohio. The trees along the road to the courthouse had begun turning yellow, but nothing about the day felt gentle. I sat in the larger courtroom holding Rachel's hand, with Parker behind us and Edward Matthews, thinner but clearer-eyed, seated beside his assigned security officer. The trial of Veronica Matthews, the event the entire city had whispered about for weeks. When Veronica entered, she no longer had her usual sharp, icy beauty. Her face was heavily made up but couldn't hide her fatigue. Still, her eyes held their familiar pride that insisted everyone else in the room was beneath her. The prosecutor began recounting the circumstances of Matthew Matthews' death, forensic inconsistencies, multiple bruises, signs of struggle, a rushed cremation with no secondary examination. Highly unusual for a wealthy family. Then the USB audio played. Veronica's voice filled the courtroom, clear and chilling. He deserved to die. I only pushed him a little. People gasped. A few shook their heads. No one spoke. Veronica shot to her feet, screaming, "That's edited. I never said that. This is a setup." Her lawyer paled, trying to pull her back down. But what truly shattered her defense was Edward's testimony. When he stood, the room froze. He gripped his cane, walking to the stand with all the strength he had left. "I stayed silent for 12 years, he said, voice shaking but not weak. "But today, I'll tell the truth." He spoke of the injuries he saw on Matthew, the loud arguments neighbors had overheard, the time Veronica blocked him from entering the house with an expression that froze his blood. The phone call from Matthew the night before he died. "Ed, I want a divorce. I'm afraid of Veronica." The room felt like all the air had been sucked out. Even the judge's face tightened. It was as if a buried truth had finally surfaced. At the end of his testimony, Edward's voice cracked. "My brother didn't die from a fall. He died because he lived beside a woman who believed she had the right to decide whether he lived or died." Veronica burst into tears, not of grief, but rage. "You betrayed the family, coward." Edward looked right at her. "I only regret not saving him." The verdict came 2 days later. Veronica Matthews was convicted of second-degree murder and obstruction of justice. Sentence, 12 years in prison. She screamed as officers cuffed her. You ruined everything. I'll never forgive you." I looked at her calmly, not triumphant, not smug, just honest. "Veronica," I said quietly, "I didn't destroy your family. You did." In that moment, her face twisted with hatred, and something in her eyes went hollow, like someone who finally realized the empire she built from manipulation and violence had collapsed beneath her feet. As she was escorted away, she looked back at the emptying courtroom. No allies, no friends, no relatives. Even those who once respected her avoided her gaze. I felt not joy, not victory, just a deep sadness for a family ruined at its roots. Rachel took my arm. "Mom, why don't I feel lighter?" I looked at her and gave a small, sad smile. "Because this is a tragedy, sweetheart. No one wins when a family has been broken for so long." She rested her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, we stepped out of the courthouse under a sky that was truly blue. Not the false blue of denial, but the blue of a new chapter opening, even though behind us we had closed one of the darkest chapters of our lives. I once thought that after Veronica and Cole were sentenced, everything would brighten instantly, like sunlight after a storm. But life moves in quieter rhythms. Consequences and changes don't arrive all at once. They seep in slowly like water into soil. And sometimes the most painful part isn't the confrontation itself, but the days that follow, when people must live with the choices they've made. One late fall morning, while I was making breakfast, Rachel walked into the kitchen with an envelope in her hand. Her expression wasn't panicked or sad, just hesitant. "Mom," she said, placing the envelope on the table, "a letter from Cole." I looked at her but didn't open it. "Do you want to read it?" Rachel inhaled softly as if gathering all her courage. "I already read it, last night." I waited. She sat down across from me, her hands clasped together but no longer trembling like before. "He apologized," Rachel said. "Cole wrote that he finally understood why everything happened. He said growing up in that kind of environment made him believe control was love. Jealousy was protection, and violence was a solution. He admitted he never truly knew what healthy love looked like. She paused for a moment, then concluded, but he also wrote that if I forgave him, he could change. And She lifted her head and looked at me, her eyes clear. I don't want to go back. I nodded. You don't have to forgive someone to be free. I know, I'm keeping the letter as a way to close the chapter, but I won't respond. I couldn't have been prouder of my daughter. News that Cole had written an apology reached Parker and even Edward. Everyone saw it as a good sign, not because they wanted Cole and Rachel back together, but because when a toxic man finally recognizes his own destruction, it usually means he no longer has the strength to hurt anyone else. But the consequences for the Matthews family didn't end with Cole and Veronica. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Parker. Linda, you need to hear this, he said. From Edward's testimony from the USB and from the financial documents the prosecutor had collected, the investigation expanded to other members of the Matthews family, those who had helped cover up Mr. Matthews' death or benefited from Veronica's wrongdoing. The cousin, a family member who secretly used company funds to hide assets. Another cousin who provided false testimony 12 years ago. One by one, they were called in for questioning. No one was arrested yet. But the shadow of truth had begun to fall over them. The Matthews empire did not collapse in a single day. It cracked, slowly and steadily, until everyone could see how rotten it truly was. But during that time, Rachel's life was healing like a lake settling after a storm. The day she received an email from an old friend, someone from the group who had once shunned her when the scandal broke, she simply read it silently, then handed it to me. Rachel, I'm sorry. I believed the wrong people. I joined in the cruel things said about you. I hope someday you'll allow me a chance to make it right. The next day, someone else messaged her, then 2 more. Then a group of friends invited her for coffee, not to check in with judgment, but with genuine sincerity. Rachel didn't immediately embrace them. She had grown. She now knew how to choose who deserved to walk beside her. The old house, the one Cole destroyed as if he wanted to erase Rachel's existence, was sold in just 6 days. Many friends asked why she didn't renovate it or stay to overcome the painful memories. Rachel only gave a sad smile. I don't want to live inside 4 walls that once trapped me. And I understood. Honestly, I didn't want her going back to a place that had eroded her freedom day by day. Rachel's new apartment was on the 4th floor of a bright building. Morning sunlight streamed through the wide window, spreading across the walls like a pale yellow cloth. I watched her arranging her belongings, the flower vase, the bookshelf, the green ceramic cups I had given her, and I realized, for the first time in a very long while, that her shoulders were no longer pulled tight in defense. My daughter was living, not merely surviving. And Veronica. The news of her stroke came to me on a weekend afternoon. Parker called, his voice low. She collapsed in her cell. A stroke. She survived, but half her body is paralyzed. I went silent. Rachel was making tea and turned toward me, worried. Mom, what's wrong? I sat down. Veronica had a stroke. Rachel said nothing. After a moment, she set the teapot on the table and exhaled softly. I'm not happy about it, she said, and I don't pity her either. She looked up, her eyes not hateful, just accepting. I just feel it's fair. Everything fell back into place in the end. I held her hand, and in that moment, I understood what I had always believed throughout my years as a lawyer. Cruelty destroys itself. We don't need to retaliate. We don't need to inflict more pain. The damage people like Veronica create usually circles back in ways no one predicts. In the days that followed, my home had more peace than ever. Morning bird song, Rachel reading in the armchair at night, sometimes resting her head on my shoulder like when she was little. We cooked together, tended the garden that had been neglected through months of exhaustion. No pounding on the door at midnight, no threats, no eyes watching from the dark, just quiet. A quiet I once believed I would never experience again. One afternoon, while Rachel was tending the balcony plants, she turned back to me and smiled. "Mom, we can breathe now." I nodded. I didn't say anything. Sometimes words cannot keep up with the feelings inside. Yes, we could finally breathe. Not because we had won, but because no fear was gripping our throats anymore. Life didn't become perfect, but it became right. And for me, that was enough. If there was a moment in my life that made me stop and take a deep, slow breath, it was the morning Rachel walked out the door wearing a pale blue blouse, her hair tied neatly back, holding the new bag she bought with her own salary. Her eyes were bright, truly bright, something I hadn't seen during the years she lived with Cole. The brightness of someone who had stepped out of a windowless room and realized the sky was wide. "I'll be okay, Mom," she said with a smile that wasn't forced. I nodded, standing on the porch, watching her descend the steps. No more darting glances, no more shrinking posture. Rachel was walking the way she used to as a child, soft but steady, as if the world beneath her feet finally had space for her. She had found a new job at a medical research center, where people greeted each other with smiles, where supervisors didn't need to shout to prove authority, and where Rachel first experienced something most people take for granted: respect. That evening when she came home, I asked, "How was it?" Rachel smiled, taking off her scarf, and said something that nearly brought me to tears. "I forgot what it feels like to be treated like a normal person, Mom." James Porter entered her life the way kindness often does, quietly, without drama, without the overwhelming intensity that makes people suspicious. He was a resident doctor in the same building Rachel worked in, a few years older, tall, broad-shouldered, gentle-faced, with a voice soft but steady. I met him for the first time at a small seminar when Rachel brought him over. "James, this is my Mom." He extended his hand, firm but not overbearing. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hawkins. Rachel talks about you all the time." I glanced at Rachel and saw her cheeks turn slightly pink, not the girlish kind of blush, but the quiet shyness of a grown woman learning to trust a new hand after being hurt for so long. Throughout the event, I observed James with the instinct of a mother who has witnessed the worst hidden behind a man's polite exterior. But James had none of the red flags I watched for. He didn't touch Rachel unless she invited it. He didn't answer questions on her behalf. He noticed when she was tired but never told her what to do. In short, he respected her boundaries. And that, to me, was as meaningful as any declaration of love. One late spring evening, Rachel came home looking conflicted. I saw it the moment she opened the door. "What happened, sweetheart?" She set her bag on the table, walked over, and sat beside me. "James proposed to me." I sat up straight. "And what did you say?" She bit her lip. "I told him I needed more time." I couldn't help but smile gently. "That's a grown-up answer." Rachel sighed and rested her head on my shoulder like she used to. "I love him, Mom, but I'm afraid of myself. I'm afraid I'm not fully healed, afraid the old shadows are still inside me, and I'll bring them into a new life without meaning to." I stroked her hair. "Rachel, Being grown doesn't mean having no wounds. It means knowing how to care for them when they return. You've already done that. You stood up, fought back, walked away when you needed to. You know your worth. You know your boundaries. That means you are healed, not because you forgot the past, but because you no longer let it decide your future. She squeezed my hand, and I felt it clearly. My daughter had truly stepped out of the darkness. One Sunday afternoon, while we were pulling weeds in the garden, Rachel suddenly said, "Mom, I want to tell my story." I froze. "You mean publicly?" Rachel nodded. "There are so many women still living in silence, Mom. I used to be one of them. I know what shame feels like, what fear feels like, what confusion feels like. I want them to know there's a way out. I want them to look at me and think, if she did it, maybe I can too." I looked at my daughter for a long time, the baby I once held when she was learning to walk, the woman I held when she shook after Cole's blows, the warrior who stood in front of her husband in a jail visitation room and said, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Now she wanted to turn pain into light. I squeezed her hand. "Then we'll tell it," I said. "Together." James supported her completely. He listened to her plans without taking over, without inserting himself, without offering cliché lines like, "You're so strong." He simply asked, "What can I do to help you?" When Rachel told me that, she burst into tears, not from sadness, from being understood. There were afternoons when I watched Rachel and James tending the garden together or fixing a bookshelf. There were mornings when I heard Rachel laughing at something James said. That laughter, I once believed I would never hear again, and in those moments I realized the future doesn't arrive in loud, triumphant waves. It comes quietly through small things: safety, peace, respect, kindness. Rachel had found all of that, and I, finally, felt my own heart loosen. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Rachel whispered, "Mom, I think I'm ready now." I knew exactly what she meant, and I smiled. "Then let the future lead the way." Rachel turned to me, her eyes shimmering the way they did when she was little. "Do you think I deserve happiness?" I took her hand. "You've deserved it for a long time, Rachel. You're only just beginning to believe it." That night, after Rachel and James left following dinner, I stood at the door watching them go, a peace settling in me so deep it surprised even myself. No more darkness hanging over this house. No more fear, no more threats, no more fighting alone. My daughter had been reborn, and somehow so had I. Our future wasn't a blazing, brilliant light, but a warm one, gentle enough to see the road ahead, steady enough to remind us every step was worthwhile. And for the first time in years, I believed we were not just surviving. We were truly living. I don't know what moment marked Rachel's clearest turning point. Was it when she bravely walked away from Cole? When she stood in front of the man who once paralyzed her with fear and said, "I want a divorce"? Or was it the calm moment she said she wanted to tell her story to help others? Maybe all of them. Or maybe it was that quiet morning when I opened the door to my study and found Rachel at her computer, shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, as if she were finally doing something that belonged to her more than anything else ever had. "Mom," she looked up, her eyes naturally bright, "I think I'm going to start a blog." "A blog?" I asked, walking closer. Rachel nodded and turned the screen toward me. The website was empty, only one simple title at the top: "Finding Myself Again, Han Trin Tim Lai Chin Ming." I read each word slowly. No embellishment, no dramatics, just a gentle but weighty declaration from someone once broken who had now chosen to stand tall again. "I want to tell the truth," Rachel said, her voice soft but steady, "not to get revenge, but so that someone, just one person, might see the door I once couldn't see." I placed my hand on her shoulder. "Then right, Rachel. You didn't just survive. You won." Her first post went up that evening. Within hours, the first comments appeared. Messages from strangers, mostly women, many using pseudonyms, some leaving only a heart, but enough to show me her story had not disappeared into the void. An email arrived after midnight from a woman in Michigan. "I've never dared tell anyone that my husband controls my phone, my money, even my clothes. When I read your story, I saw myself. Thank you for speaking out." The next morning, 3 more emails, then 10, then 50. Rachel read each one, and every time she finished, she sat quietly for a moment, as if gathering the pain of others into her chest to understand, to share, to make sure none of it was overlooked. Watching her, I saw a woman whose personal suffering had become a fire, not to burn herself, but to warm others. As for me, I continued my work as before, but something fundamental shifted. My name began reaching women who saw me as a safe place. One young woman walked into my office on a Friday afternoon. "Mrs. Hawkins," she said, her hands clasped tightly, "I read your daughter's blog. I want to ask, do I have the right to leave?" Another called close to midnight. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I don't know who else to call." I'm no superhero. I don't have solutions for every kind of pain, but I know how to help them open the first door. The door leading out of the invisible walls that abuse builds. Rachel always said, "Mom, you were the foundation I stood on." But through this journey, I stood taller because of her, too. One early summer evening, Rachel walked into the living room with a manuscript nearly 200 pages thick. "What's this?" I asked. "My blog," she smiled, "but I think it needs to become something bigger." I smiled back, understanding immediately. "It'll be a book," I said. "Not just a book, Mom," Rachel said softly. "I want it to be a reminder for women who can't see a way out. I want them to know that the light doesn't disappear. Sometimes it's just hidden by someone else's shadow." I flipped through a few pages. There was Rachel's voice, gentle, patient, braver than ever. Suddenly I said, "I'm writing too." Rachel turned to me, wide-eyed. "What are you writing?" "A memoir, but not about law or victories. About motherhood. About the journey of learning not to lose myself while trying to protect someone else." She set her manuscript down and leaned her head on my shoulder. "Let's do it together?" I nodded, and in that moment I realized we had moved into a new chapter. No longer survivors running from pain, but women standing still, facing it, then shaping it into strength. One gentle Sunday morning, we decided to visit my husband's grave after nearly a year. The cemetery was quiet, lined with maple trees, unmoving in the still air. I brought white lilies, the kind he used to buy me on days that weren't special to anyone but him. Standing before the headstone, Rachel bent down to place the flowers, her hand trembling slightly. Her voice was small but clear. "I'm okay now, Dad." A breeze lifted a few strands of her hair. Sunlight filtered through the trees, falling across her face, making her look both strong and pure. I placed my hand on her back, my chest tightening. "He's proud of you," I whispered, "of both of us." We stood there a long time without speaking. In that silence, I felt my husband's warmth, as quiet, steady, and gentle as he had always been in our lives. On the drive home, Rachel turned to me, her eyes bright with a sudden understanding. "You know, if I hadn't gone through all of that, Maybe I wouldn't be who I am today, and I wouldn't be able to help those women. I took her hand. Suffering should never be the price for becoming strong, I said. But when it happens, how we rise, that's what defines us. Rachel smiled. I rose because of you. I looked at my daughter for a long moment, then answered through a tightening in my throat. No, Rachel, you rose because of yourself. I only lit the path. And for the first time in this long, winding journey, I realized both of us had found our new purpose, not to end a battle, but to begin a healing journey for others, a mission born from love, pain, and a light that even the deepest darkness could never extinguish. I spent nearly a year finishing the final draft of the memoir, a book I had first intended to write only for myself, but eventually realized it belonged to far more people than just me. It belonged to the women living in silence the way Rachel once did. It belonged to the mothers who had sat alone in the dark, breathless with worry because their daughters hadn't called. It belonged to those trapped in relationships where love had become nothing more than a mask for control and violence. The day I placed the last period on the manuscript, I reread the opening line, a sentence I had written with everything left in me after a long, exhausting but beautiful journey. If our story helps even one person, then all the pain was worth it. It wasn't poetic, it was the truth. A truth I had lived, witnessed, and chosen to believe in. Because in the midst of fear, in the cruelty of those who use power to harm, in the nights when I thought I would collapse, it was the understanding of strangers that kept us standing. Now I wanted to give that back to someone else. I dedicated the final chapter of the book to something I hadn't been able to say out loud for many years. That kind love is a right, not a gift. No one should have to endure, fear, or accept abuse in any form. No one should live under excuses like, I did it because I love you. And no mother should have to watch her child wither under a love that was never real. I wrote, you deserve kindness. You deserve a love that doesn't ask you to give up yourself just to survive. When Rachel read those lines, she didn't say a word. She simply walked over, wrapped her arms around me from behind, and rested her head on my shoulder for a long time. It was both a thank you and a reminder of how far we had come. Life after that was no longer loud, no more late-night phone calls, no more strange cars parked outside the gate, no more jolting awake at small noises. Rachel reclaimed her life, piece by piece, habit by habit, each morning with birdsong and a cup of coffee she made herself, each afternoon where she looked in the mirror and didn't see shame or fear. And I found the peace I had believed was lost forever. We kept our Sunday ritual, sitting in the garden, watching the sun sink behind the trees. In the early days, it was where we whispered about the pain. Now, it was where we revisited the past with a strange tenderness, not to forget, but to remember differently, softer, warmer, more grateful. I think I'm healed, Mom, Rachel said one evening as the wind carried the scent of lavender across the yard. I turned to her and smiled. You're not just healed, Rachel. You've bloomed. She laughed gently, her eyes shimmering as though they held the whole evening sky. The day my memoir was ready to send to the publisher, I sat before my computer and wrote the final note. Not a blessing, not a farewell, but a message for whoever would step into this story next, someone like you, listening to me recount this journey from beginning to end. I wrote, if you've read this far, where are you standing in your own story? What did this journey touch inside your heart? If you want to share, I'm here. I'm listening. because I know there are stories that just need a place to be spoken so they no longer stay buried in the dark. I added, "Thank you, whoever you are, for spending the time to walk with me and my daughter through each page. Not everyone has the patience, and even fewer have the courage to stay through a story like this. And that is the truth. Not everyone dares to stay until the end of someone else's wounds." I closed the manuscript and inhaled deeply. I had written it, and now, instead of leaving those words only inside a book, I want to speak them to you, the person hearing me in this moment. Please share your thoughts below or your own story if you feel ready. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you can join me on more healing journeys. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. I looked up and saw Rachel standing at the doorway watching me with warm, loving eyes. "Mom," she said softly, "I'm proud of you." I smiled. My tears fell, not from pain or fear, but from knowing we had walked through a darkness so profound it once felt endless, and somehow we still made it here, to a place with light, with kindness, with peace. I close the story. I am Linda Harrington, a mother who saved her daughter, and a woman who found herself again. And if you're somewhere out there listening, remember that you, too, can find your light anytime, whenever you're ready. She doesn't need to look at the menu. Elaine Bennett smiled at the waiter. Just give her the simplest dish. I looked up. My son stayed silent. My daughter-in-law avoided my eyes. In that moment, I understood a bitter truth. I wasn't invited here as a mother. I was invited as a problem to be handled. I nodded, smiled, and said nothing. They had no idea that the woman wearing this old dress had signed contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. And they knew even less. Tonight, I didn't come here to eat dinner. I came to see who they really were. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. The restaurant sat on the top floor of a historic hotel in downtown Boston, where the red brick exterior stood in stark contrast to the luxurious interior. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in crisp white linen. The silverware arranged with such precision it felt almost impersonal. Through the large glass windows behind our table, I could see the Charles River shimmering at night, the lights reflecting on the water like memories that refused to fade. This was the first time I was meeting Claire's parents, my daughter-in-law's parents, and also the first time in many years that I felt this out of place. I sat upright in the soft leather chair, my hands resting lightly on my lap. My old, worn fabric bag hung neatly on the back of the chair. The dress I was wearing was ash gray, simple in style, one I had owned for many years. It wasn't ugly, but it clearly didn't belong here. I knew that the moment I walked in and felt the glances sweep over me, quick, cold, and full of judgment, Andrew, my son, sat to my right. He was 36 now, a grown man with a steady job, broad shoulders, straight posture. But at that moment, he was staring down into his water glass as if it held the answer to all his troubles. I recognized that habit from when he was a child. When Andrew went quiet like that, it meant he was avoiding something. Claire sat to Andrew's left wearing a navy blue dress that fit her perfectly, elegant without being flashy. She was beautiful in the way fashion magazines love. Bright face, softly curled brown hair, just enough makeup. But since we sat down, Claire had barely looked at me for more than a second. Every time our eyes met, she quickly looked away, pretending to adjust her napkin, check her phone, or gaze out the window. Across from me sat Elaine Bennett. She was in her early 60s, her light blonde hair carefully styled, not a strand out of place. The jewelry she wore wasn't large, but one glance was enough for me to know it was far from inexpensive. Every movement Elaine made carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to, favored, and taken seriously. Beside her was Thomas Bennett, her husband, a man with a deep voice and the demeanor of someone used to making decisions. He didn't speak much, but every sentence was short and firm, as if no one would think to challenge him. Elaine's comment to the waiter came the moment we lifted our menus. Her tone was gentle, almost caring, but I had lived long enough to know that some words don't need to be loud to wound deeply. Just give her the simplest dish. She didn't ask what I wanted. She didn't look at me to confirm. She didn't treat me as someone with the right to choose. I looked up instinctively, my gaze passing over everyone at the table. Andrew remained silent. Claire lightly bit her lower lip. Elaine smiled, satisfied. Thomas took a sip of water, not participating, but not stopping it either. And in that moment, something became crystal clear in my mind, sharp as a freshly cleaned mirror. I wasn't invited here as Andrew's mother. I was invited here to be evaluated. I felt a faint heat rise up my neck, but I took a deep breath and steadied my breathing. I had learned this a long time ago, in boardrooms, in tense negotiations, in situations where a single emotional misstep could cost you everything. I nodded to the waiter and smiled politely. Yes, that's fine. Elaine's smile widened just a little, as if she had done something right. The waiter folded the menus, bowed slightly, and walked away. I knew that if at that moment I had said, "No, I'd like to see the menu," or "I can choose for myself," the atmosphere at the table would have shifted instantly. But I didn't. Not because I was weak, but because I was curious. I wanted to see how far they would go if I let everything unfold the way they wanted it to. I began to observe. Thomas talked about their recent trip to Napa Valley, his voice even but unmistakably proud. Elaine followed, describing a charity fundraiser where she met very valuable connections. Claire nodded along with her mother's story, occasionally adding small details as if to prove she belonged in that world too. Andrew only spoke when directly addressed, and his answers were shorter than usual. I looked at my son, and a heavy feeling rose in my chest. Not anger, but disappointment. Not disappointment that Andrew didn't defend me, but because I realized he was ashamed. No one said it out loud, but I could see it clearly in the way Andrew avoided my eyes, in how he adjusted his collar whenever Elaine glanced at me, in the tension visible in his hands clasped together under the table. I suddenly understood that, in the Bennett family's eyes, I wasn't just Andrew's mother. I was a variable that didn't fit the picture they had painted for their son's life. A simple mother. A past that needed to be softened, a detail that should be controlled. The thought made my chest ache, but I didn't show it. I was used to being judged by appearances. I was used to being placed into neat little boxes that made other people comfortable. It was just that. It had been a very long time since I had been sitting on this side of the table. I looked at the glass in front of me, the light reflecting off its clear surface, distorting my own image. The woman in the old dress looked calm, almost harmless. If they knew that this woman had once led meetings where hundreds of people sat in silence, waiting for her to speak, if they knew that she had signed contracts capable of changing the lives of thousands of people, if they knew. I quietly clenched my hands. No, tonight was not the time for them to know. Tonight, I wanted to see every layer of their masks. I wanted to see how they would treat me when they believed I had nothing to offer them. And when the appetizer arrived, a small, simple portion placed in front of me while elaborate, artfully presented plates were set before everyone else, I knew my decision to stay silent had been the right one. This wouldn't be just a dinner. This was when I began to remember every look, every word, every polite but cold smile. Because sometimes the only way to truly understand a person is to let them believe you are nothing at all. When the appetizer was set in front of me, I kept the same polite smile. But inside, a different stream of thought was quietly unfolding. Not for them, but for those listening to this story. Perhaps it was time I said something that, for many years, only I and very few people in my professional circle had known. I am not the woman Andrew, my son, thinks I am. For more than 20 years, I have held a senior executive position at a multinational corporation, headquartered in the United States, operating across major markets in North America and Europe. My work isn't glamorous in the way that makes headlines, but every decision I sign involves millions of dollars, sometimes the livelihoods of entire chains of people I've never met. I am used to closed-door meetings, negotiations that stretch late into the night, and the pressure of always having to be sharp and precise. My income, to be blunt, is far higher than anyone would imagine looking at the old dress I'm wearing tonight. Each month, the number alone would make many people pause. Beyond my salary, I hold company shares, long-term investments in retirement funds, commercial real estate, and several early-stage projects I joined when few believed they would succeed. My bank account has never been something I worry about, even during the most difficult economic periods. But Andrew doesn't know any of that. My son grew up believing his mother was just a long-time administrative employee at an ordinary company, a woman who went to work regularly, came home on time, lived in a small apartment, and never talked about money. And that wasn't because I lied. I simply didn't say more. I've lived in the same two-bedroom apartment for nearly 20 years. It's in a quiet neighborhood, not upscale, but clean and safe. The old elevator creaks every time it goes up or down. The hallway is narrow, the yellow lights slightly dim. There's no large balcony, no floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, skyline. But there's enough morning light, a compact kitchen, and a living room big enough for an old sofa and a bookshelf filled with books I've read many times. I could have moved long ago. In fact, real estate agents have called me more times than I can count, pitching Riverview penthouses and townhouses in expensive neighborhoods where the annual property tax alone could support another family comfortably. But every time I declined. Not because I'm stingy, but because I don't see the need. I grew up poor, not the romantic kind of poverty you see in inspirational stories, but the kind that forces you to count every dollar, every meal. I lived in cramped rentals, wore old shoes to school, watched my mother work herself to exhaustion just to make sure I didn't have to drop out. Those years taught me something very early. Money can bring security, but showing it off rarely brings peace. When I first began making real money, I was tempted. I won't deny that. I stood in luxury stores, considered buying a car far more expensive than I needed, imagined living in a space that would make others admire me. But each time I asked myself, am I buying this because I need it or because I want to prove something? The answer wasn't always comfortable. And then I realized that the greatest freedom money gives me isn't the ability to buy anything I want, but the ability not to buy what I don't need. I deliberately kept Andrew away from those privileges, not because I didn't love him, but because I loved him too much. I didn't want him to grow up feeling like his path had already been paved. I wanted him to understand the value of work, effort, and taking responsibility for his own life. Andrew went to school on scholarships. He worked part-time during college. He complained about boring jobs, difficult bosses, mornings he had to wake up early even when he didn't want to. I listened, but I didn't intervene. I didn't call anyone to help him. I didn't use my connections to open doors in advance. I raised my son with discipline and consistency. Andrew knew there were things he had to do himself, consequences he had to face on his own. I didn't cushion him with money, and I didn't turn myself into a lifeline every time things got hard. I was always there, but behind him, not in front of him. Perhaps that's why Andrew always thought of me as just an ordinary woman, a kind but somewhat strict mother, living so simply that it sometimes made him feel embarrassed. And I let him think that. I never tried to correct that impression, not because I feared the truth, but because I feared the consequences of telling it. I was afraid that if Andrew knew who I truly was in the outside world, our relationship would change. I feared he would look at me differently, not as his mother, but as a mother with money. I feared his decisions might be influenced even slightly by the existence of an invisible safety net. And until recently, my life was peaceful that way. I went to work, came home, read books, took walks on weekend mornings. Andrew visited when he could. We ate dinner together in my small kitchen. No talk of money, no unspoken comparisons, no tension. Everything began to change when Andrew got married. The Bennett family entered my life very clearly. They were nothing like me. They were used to displaying their status, to social relationships built on financial foundations, to measuring people by what they owned. From the first stories Andrew told me about them, I sensed the difference. And tonight's dinner was the first test, not just for them, but for me. I wanted to know how they would treat me when they believed I had nothing to offer. I wanted to know, without money standing between us, what a person's value looked like in their eyes. The Bennett family entered my life as a test I never sought, but never intended to avoid. And as I sat there, the simplest dish on the table placed in front of me, I understood that the peace I once had was likely over. But sometimes, peace has to be broken, so the truth can finally step into the light. Andrew's call came on a late afternoon, just as I set the kettle down on the stove and leaned against the windowsill, looking out at the small street below. Boston's sky that day was a pale gray, not raining but not sunny either, the kind of in-between weather the city is known for during the changing seasons. I remember thinking, before answering, that it would probably be another short call, asking about my health, reminding me to dress warmly or saying he'd be busy that weekend. Andrew's voice came through the line with a slight hesitation, subtle enough that most people might miss it, but I didn't. "Mom, I want to tell you something." I leaned back against the wall, holding the phone close to my ear. "Okay, go ahead." "Claire's parents, they're in Boston this week, and they want to meet you." I stayed silent for a few seconds, not because I was surprised, but because I had always known this moment would come. Andrew had been married for almost a year, and the two families meeting was only a matter of time. But the way he said it, almost as if he were asking for permission, as if he were testing my reaction, caught my attention. "Where do they want to meet?" I asked calmly. Andrew took a light breath, then said the name of the restaurant. It was a name I knew very well, not because I had eaten there, but because, in the business world, it was often mentioned as a symbol of status. One of the most expensive restaurants in Boston, a place people didn't go just to eat, but to be seen and to be recognized. I looked out the window again, street lights beginning to turn on one by one. "That restaurant?" I said, giving nothing away. "That's fine." Andrew seemed relieved that I agreed so quickly. He went on about the time, about how Claire had made the reservation, about how it would be an intimate dinner. I listened, nodding out of habit, until a thought surfaced in my mind, quiet but impossible to ignore. "Andrew," I said, interrupting him, "what do Claire's parents know about me?" There was a very brief pause on the other end of the line. So brief that, if I hadn't known Andrew so well, I might not have noticed it. But I know every breath my son takes. "Well, I just told them you live simply," Andrew replied. "You know, you've always lived that way." The word simply was spoken lightly, as if it were obvious, as if it were a harmless description, but it landed on me heavier than Andrew realized. Simply. Not works at a corporation, not raised her son on her own, not is a strong woman, just simply. In that moment, something tightened in my chest. Not anger, but sadness. A quiet, familiar sadness, like realizing you've been neatly placed into a corner, not because you belong there, but because someone else thinks that's where you fit best. I didn't say anything right away. I let Andrew keep explaining that Claire's parents were fairly traditional, that they cared about appearances, that they just wanted a pleasant dinner. Andrew didn't say it outright, but I could hear a very clear hope in his words. He hoped I wouldn't make things complicated. And I understood. I understood that, on some level, my son was embarrassed by me. Not embarrassed because I was a bad person, but embarrassed because I didn't fit into the new world he was stepping into. That realization didn't hit me all at once. It came slowly, like rereading an old letter, and suddenly understanding the lines between the lines. I remembered the times Andrew suggested I buy newer clothes before attending events, the times he gently reminded me not to talk too much about my everyday life in front of his friends. Small details I had once brushed off, now rearranging themselves into a clearer picture. I didn't blame Andrew. If there is one thing I've learned in this life, it's this. Children don't mean to hurt their parents. They are only trying to find their place in the world, and sometimes in that process, they unconsciously push the people they love aside. "Okay," I said finally, my voice still gentle. "I understand." Andrew exhaled, clearly relieved. He added a few words about hoping I'd arrive on time, then said goodbye and hung up. I stood there for a long time after the phone screen went dark. My apartment was so quiet I could hear the steady ticking of the wall clock. I looked around the room, the old but clean sofa, the dark wooden bookshelf, the small dining table just big enough for two. Everything here was familiar, marked by a life that wasn't flashy, but never lacking either. I walked slowly into the bedroom and opened my closet. On one side were the clothes I wore every day, simple, durable, easy to wash. Toward the back, carefully hidden, were the clothes I wore for work. Tailored suits, silk blouses, good leather shoes, two worlds coexisting in the same space, rarely touching. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on my knees, and for the first time since Andrew called, I allowed myself to think more deeply about the question that had just been asked. What did they know about me? The answer was simple. They only knew what Andrew wanted them to know. And that led me to another thought, one that made me furrow my brow, then let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. If they think I'm a simple woman, then I'll be a simple woman, not because I want to deceive anyone, but because I want to see the truth. I want to know how they will treat me when they believe I have no money, no power, no connections that benefit them. I want to know, behind the polite smiles and flowery words, where a person's true value really lies in their eyes. At first, that thought made me feel a little cruel. But then I remembered how it felt to hear the word simple used almost as an apology on my behalf. I remembered Andrew's averted gaze, and I understood that sometimes, to protect yourself, you have to allow the truth to reveal itself instead of rushing to shield it. I stood up and closed the closet door. In the mirror, I saw an older woman, her face lined with wrinkles, her expression calm. No one could guess what she had lived through or what she held in her hands, and perhaps that was my greatest advantage. I decided I wouldn't explain anything more to Andrew. I wouldn't call back to clarify who I was or what I did. I would go to that dinner exactly as they had already imagined me, and let the truth reveal itself, not through words, but through how they treated me. That evening, after deciding to let the truth unfold in its own way, I did nothing more than tidy the kitchen, wash the half-finished teacup, and turn off some of the lights in the apartment. But that night, I didn't sleep deeply. Not because I was worried, but because my mind kept replaying very old images, moments I thought I had long forgotten. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Pale sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, laying a soft yellow glow across the floor. The apartment was as quiet as ever, unchanged. But I knew that from this day on, something inside me was different. I opened the closet. In front were the clothes I wore every day. Neutral sweaters, simple trousers, dresses that never went out of style but never stood out either. Pushed neatly to the back was a small space where I kept things I rarely used. Hanging there was a gray dress, faded with time. That dress had been with me through many stages of my life. I bought it more than 10 years ago when I still had to think carefully about every expense. It wasn't ugly, just painfully ordinary. The fabric had softened from countless washes, the stitching at the hem no longer sharp. I had meant to give it away for years, but each time I hesitated and hung it back in its place. I pulled the dress out and laid it on the bed. Just looking at it, I knew this was exactly what I needed. I chose an old pair of shoes from the corner of the shoe rack. The soles were worn, the shine long gone. I bent down and brushed a thin layer of dust from the toes. They weren't torn or broken, but they clearly weren't something you'd wear to a fine restaurant. In the bathroom, I tied my hair neatly back, a simple style, nothing elaborate. I looked at the small makeup case on the shelf, the one I used for work, but then I closed it. No lipstick, no powder, no attempt to hide the wrinkles that had been there for years. I took my watch off my wrist and placed it in the drawer. No rings, no necklace, no earrings. My hands were bare, looking thinner without any adornment. I knew that in the world of people like the Bennett family, those small details could say a great deal. I took the old fabric bag hanging behind the door. The straps were frayed, the color uneven. I opened it and checked inside. Aside from my wallet, keys, and phone, I put in only one regular credit card, the kind I almost never used for work. It was enough for everyday expenses, nothing more. The black card was in a different wallet. I opened the nightstand drawer and took it out, looking at it for a long moment. The muted black surface reflected the dim light of the room. I didn't hesitate, but I didn't rush either. I slid it into the hidden inner pocket of the bag, where no one would see it unless I chose to take it out. Everything was ready. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bedroom. The woman looking back at me was a version of myself I barely recognized. The gray dress revealed a figure no longer as straight as it once was. The worn shoes made my stance look heavier. My unmade face showed every wrinkle, every mark left by time. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I had never looked like this. On the contrary, I had been this woman for a very long stretch of my life. But it had been many years since I had consciously chosen to become her again. A strange feeling rose in my chest, as if I were deliberately stripping away everything I had built, returning to an old, forgotten starting point. The feeling of having my value erased came quickly and vividly. I knew that the moment I stepped outside like this, many people would automatically look at me differently, with less respect, with less patience, with less willingness to listen. I placed my hand on the cold mirror and looked straight into my own eyes. Those eyes were still mine, not afraid, not uncertain. Only the outer layer had changed. How they judge me, I whispered softly, is their choice. That sentence wasn't meant to comfort me. It was a reminder. I can't control what others think, but I can control how I respond to it. I wasn't doing this to diminish myself. I was doing this to understand them better. When I put on my coat and stepped out of the apartment, the familiar hallway greeted me with the smell of old paint and the soft yellow light. Don, the morning doorman, nodded at me as he did every day. "Good morning, Mrs. Lawson," he said with a friendly smile. "Good morning, Don," I replied naturally. He didn't look at me any differently. No one here ever did. To them, I was still just the woman in apartment 403 who always greeted people politely and paid her rent on time. And in that moment, I suddenly realized real respect doesn't come from what I'm hiding in my bag, but from how I've lived all these years. But I also knew that once I stepped into the world of the Bennett family, that wouldn't be true anymore. On the way to the restaurant, I chose to take a taxi instead of driving, not because I needed to, but because I wanted everything to stay consistent with the role I had chosen. The driver didn't ask many questions. He turned on the radio, an old song playing softly. I looked out the window as the city passed by. Familiar buildings, busy people, each carrying their own story. I took a deep breath when the car stopped in front of the hotel where the restaurant was located. The entrance was paved with gleaming stone. The staff stood upright in tailored suits. I stepped out of the car, gripping the strap of my fabric bag tightly. In that moment, I felt like I was stepping onto a stage where I had already chosen my role. Not the role of the winner, not the role of the wealthy, but the role of the underestimated. And I was ready. Ready to be looked down on. Ready to be placed into convenient boxes, ready to hear things they would never say if they knew who I really was. I walked inside, blending into the lights, the voices, the refined scent of the restaurant. Inside me, there was no anger, no bitterness, only a very clear awareness. I knew what I was doing. I knew what I was trading away. And more importantly, I knew that when tonight was over, it wouldn't be only them who would be exposed. I would see myself as well, not through the lens of power or money, but through how I faced being seen as less and still kept my dignity. The moment I stepped through the glass doors of the restaurant, I felt the first gaze fall on me. It wasn't a direct stare, nor was it outright rude. It was the kind of glance that skimmed quickly, then lingered a beat too long, long enough to assess, long enough to categorize. The host, dressed in a neat black suit, smiled politely, but the smile was just slightly delayed, as if his mind were processing something that didn't quite fit. The old dress, the worn shoes, the faded fabric bag. in a space where everything else was polished and carefully curated. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" His voice was still courteous, but his eyes passed over me once more. "Yes," I replied calmly. "The Bennett family." There was a very subtle shift in his expression, not surprise, but adjustment. He nodded and gestured for me to follow. I walked slowly past tightly spaced tables, the soft clink of cutlery against plates, the low murmur of conversation flowing like an unbroken current. And then I saw Andrew. My son stood up the moment he saw me approaching. But the movement was incomplete. He rose, then hesitated, as if unsure what to do next. Andrew's eyes flicked quickly over me, from the dress to the shoes, then turned away almost immediately. In that instant, I saw the unease clearly on the face I had looked at for more than 30 years. Not unease at seeing his mother, but unease because his mother appeared exactly as he had described her to others. Claire stood beside Andrew. My daughter-in-law looked radiant in the way this place favored. Her dress was finely cut, understated but clearly tailored. Her hair was softly styled, her makeup just enough to highlight her youth. But when Claire's eyes met mine, the smile on her lips didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Mom," Claire said, stepping forward to hug me very quickly, very lightly. That hug felt more like a formality than a gesture of affection. "Hello, dear," I replied, my voice as gentle as always. Elaine Bennett was the next person I noticed. She sat upright in her chair, both hands neatly placed on the table. As I came closer, Elaine lifted her head, her eyes traveling from the top of my hair down to the hem of my dress, then stopping at the fabric bag hanging from my arm. She didn't speak right away. She simply observed. Thomas Bennett stood up last. He shook my hand, brief and firm, but without any warmth. A polite handshake, nothing more. "Very nice to meet you," Thomas said. "Andrew has told us a few things about you." "I hope they were good things," I smiled. He smiled back, but didn't answer directly. We sat down. My chair was placed slightly off-center, not at the head of the table. A small detail, but I noticed it. Elaine adjusted her napkin, then turned to me. "Was the trip here smooth?" she asked, her tone light, just concerned enough. "Quite smooth," I replied. "Boston traffic has been very heavy lately," she continued, "especially for people who aren't used to driving downtown." The comment wasn't exactly insulting, but it carried an assumption that I was easily overwhelmed by this city, by this pace of life. I simply nodded, offering no objection. Thomas signaled the waiter to bring wine. He began talking about a bottle of red that had just arrived, emphasizing the vintage, the vineyard, and how difficult it was to find on the market. Elaine nodded along, adding a few details about their recent trip to California, where they had happened to look at some coastal properties. "We're considering buying another one," Elaine said casually. "You never know, Andrew and Claire might need it someday." Andrew hesitated slightly. Claire smiled, but there was tension in it. I sat there, listening, not interrupting. I knew this style of conversation well. It wasn't meant to share. It was meant to establish position, to remind everyone at the table who had the ability to give and who should be aware of that. Elaine turned to me. "Where do you live again?" she asked. "On the west side of the city," I replied. "Oh," Elaine nodded. "That area is quite quiet, very suitable for people who value stability." Stability, another word chosen with care. "What kind of work do you do?" Thomas asked next, his tone neutral. "I work in an office," I said briefly, just as Andrew had painted the picture. "Ah," Elaine smiled. Jobs like that are very respectable. Not everyone needs high-pressure positions. What matters is having a balanced life." That compliment landed softly, but I heard every word. It wasn't recognition, it was placement, as if she were setting me on a lower rung of a ladder, then nodding in satisfaction because I knew my place. The waiter brought the menus. Elaine glanced through hers quickly, then began ordering for the table. When it came to me, she turned to the waiter and smiled. "She'll have the simplest dish. She probably isn't used to menus like this." The sentence was delivered so gently that anyone who reacted would seem overly sensitive. But I saw Andrew clench his hand under the table. Claire lowered her head. My dish arrived first. A small portion, simply presented. No elaborate garnish, no complex sauce. Meanwhile, in front of the others were carefully arranged plates, rich aromas drifting upward. Thomas took a sip of wine and continued talking about a new project, about people he had recently met, about very promising connections. Elaine added a few remarks, emphasizing names and places that, if I wanted to, I could easily have commented on. But I didn't. I stayed silent. And I remembered. I remembered the way Elaine looked at me whenever money was mentioned. I remembered Thomas's eyes when power came up. I remembered Andrew's silence and Claire's hesitation. The atmosphere at the table grew heavier. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Conversations about money, success, and status flowed past me like a prolonged test. And I sat there in my old dress with the cheapest dish on the table, listening to every soft word lined with hidden thorns. I knew this was only the beginning. When the plates were nearly cleared, Elaine Bennett was the first to set her knife and fork down. The gesture was light and proper, but I recognized it as a signal. She turned to me, her face relaxing into a gentler smile than before. The kind people use when they're about to say something they believe is for your own good. "Margaret," Elaine began slowly, as if choosing her words with care, "I just want to say, we truly admire you." I looked up calmly. The word admire sounded pleasant, but I had long learned to distinguish between words and the intentions behind them. "Raising a child on your own is never easy," she continued, "especially under circumstances when not everyone has many resources." The way she hesitated before the word resources caught my attention. No one at the table reacted. Thomas sipped his wine. Andrew shifted slightly in his chair. Claire stared down at her napkin. "I've always told Thomas," Elaine went on, "that women like you deserve respect. Strong, enduring. But because of that, we do worry." "Worry?" I asked softly. "Yes," Elaine nodded. "You know, age eventually comes for all of us. Health, medical expenses, unexpected things. When you're young, you can manage, but later on..." She let the sentence trail off, then glanced at Andrew. "Andrew is a good son, very responsible. We can see that clearly." Andrew flinched slightly, as if he hadn't expected to be pulled into the conversation this way. He sat up straighter, but tension showed in his eyes. "He always puts others first," Thomas added, his voice low and steady. "And that's exactly why we think some things should be arranged early." I said nothing. I rested my hand on the edge of the table and listened. "Andrew and Claire have their whole future ahead of them," Thomas continued, looking at his son seriously. "Careers, family, children. We want them to focus on building their lives without being distracted by unnecessary pressures." "Unnecessary pressures," I heard the phrase clearly. Elaine nodded, then turned back to me. "Margaret, you understand what we're saying, don't you?" I understood, very clearly. We've discussed it, Elaine went on, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. And we thought that if we could offer you a bit of financial support, everyone would feel more at ease. Andrew turned to me. Mom. Andrew. Elaine placed a hand on her son's arm, her voice softening. We're just talking. Claire remained silent. She didn't look at me, and she didn't look at her parents either. Her gaze rested on the edge of the table, where subtle patterns ran like a road with no turn. You mean, I asked, though I already knew the answer. We were thinking, Elaine said, a monthly allowance. Nothing big, just enough to help you feel more comfortable, so you won't have to worry about future expenses. Thomas nodded. Family support. No strings attached. No strings attached. I almost smiled at the choice of words. Of course, Elaine added as if suddenly remembering something. We also think that given the current situation, it might be better if you didn't visit too often. Andrew and Claire need their own space. Young couples, you understand. And that was when the unspoken condition became clear, bright under the table lights. Money in exchange for disappearance. No one said it outright, but it didn't need to be said. The intention hung between us, heavy and cold. I looked at Elaine. She still wore her smile, but there was careful calculation in her eyes. I looked at Thomas. He wasn't smiling, but his gaze was firm, as if this were a reasonable, generous offer. I realized then that, in their minds, I wasn't Andrew's mother. I was a variable, a risk factor to be managed early, not with understanding, but with money. Andrew began shifting in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. I don't think... He started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. Andrew, Thomas cut in, his tone firmer, we're talking about long-term planning, about responsibility. I looked at my son. Conflict was written all over his face. On one side were his in-laws, helping him in his career and life. On the other side was me, and in between was Claire's silence. My daughter-in-law said nothing. She didn't object. She didn't agree. She was simply quiet. That silence, in its own way, weighed heavier than words. I turned back to Elaine. You want me to keep my distance? I asked lightly, as if confirming a small detail. Elaine tilted her head slightly. Just more appropriate for everyone. Appropriate. I nodded slowly. And that allowance. How much would it be? Andrew looked at me in surprise. Perhaps he expected me to refuse immediately. Perhaps he thought I would react, but I didn't. Elaine seemed relieved that I didn't push back. We're thinking a modest amount, but enough so you won't have to worry. Thomas added, reinforcing it. We don't want you to feel abandoned. We just want things to be clear. Clear. In my mind, everything suddenly became very sharp. Not because I was angry, but because the final picture had come together. They didn't believe they were doing something wrong. In their value system, this was a civilized solution. They use money to buy peace of mind, to buy order, to buy distance. And they believed that I, in my old dress, with the cheapest dish on the table, would be grateful for it. I didn't answer right away. I lowered my gaze, picked up my glass of water, and took a small sip. The cool water slid down my throat, helping me keep my voice steady. Your offer is very thoughtful, I said at last. Andrew looked at me, confused. Claire lifted her head for the first time since the dinner began. Elaine smiled, clearly thinking she was on the right path. I need some time to think, I added. Things like this shouldn't be decided in a hurry. Of course, Elaine replied immediately, unable to hide her satisfaction. We just wanted you to know that were always ready to help. Help. I nodded and set the glass down. In that moment, I knew I had what I needed. Not an answer, but confirmation. I had seen the true nature of this offer. I had seen how far they were willing to go if they believed I was the weaker one. And I also knew that the best thing I could do now was to let them keep talking, to keep revealing themselves, to keep believing they were in control. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted to hear more, until there was no doubt left about who they truly were. I placed my hand on the table, not to claim space, but to steady myself. Their words still hung between us, heavy like smoke after a small fire. Elaine sat upright. Thomas leaned slightly forward. Andrew watched me as if waiting for a verdict. And Claire was quiet in a way that told me she knew this dinner was about to turn in another direction. "I'll tell you a story," I said, my voice calm, not loud, not emphasized, not to argue and not to justify myself, just so you understand where I come from. No one interrupted. I looked down at my hands that had worked all their lives, faint calluses softened by time, but the memory of them never fading. "I grew up in an old rental building in the southern part of the state," I began. "My parents worked themselves to exhaustion, and there was never enough money. I learned very early that if I wanted to survive, I had to stand on my own." I paused briefly, long enough for old images to come back clearly. The small kitchen, the refrigerator that rattled at night, winter mornings when I went to school in a thin coat because there wasn't a thicker one. "When Andrew was born," I continued, "I was on my own. No family nearby, no support, no safety net, just a newborn baby and an hourly job." Andrew shifted slightly. I knew this part. He'd never heard all of it. "I worked from early morning until late at night," I said, not looking directly at my son. 12 hours was normal, some days 14. I carried Andrew to the neighbor's house to ask them to watch him, then ran off to work. I came home when he was already asleep. The next morning, I left again before he woke up. Elaine pressed her lips together slightly. Thomas stopped leaning back in his chair. "At night," I continued, "when everything was quieter, I studied. I enrolled in evening classes. I borrowed books from the library. I studied in the kitchen under a dim light with a cheap cup of coffee beside me." I looked at Andrew then. "You never knew any of that, did you?" He shook his head very slightly. "I didn't tell you," I said, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want you to grow up thinking things came easily. I wanted you to understand the value of doing things yourself, learning for yourself, standing back up when you fall. I turned back to Elaine and Thomas. I started at the very bottom of a corporation, secretary, then assistant, then junior manager. I had no one backing me. No connections. I had only one thing. I didn't quit. The atmosphere at the table changed noticeably. The clinking of cutlery from nearby tables suddenly felt distant, as if we were sitting in a closed room. I moved up step by step, I said evenly. Each step meant more responsibility, more hours, more difficult decisions. There were nights I came home at 2 a.m., and the next morning I still woke up early to take Andrew to school. I paused and took a deep breath. There were sacrifices you never knew about, opportunities I turned down because I couldn't travel for weeks at a time, positions I accepted later than others because I needed flexible hours to be a mother. Andrew stared at me, as if trying to piece together fragments he'd never had before. "And then," I said, "one day things began to change. My work was recognized. I was given bigger projects. I learned how to lead, not with authority, but with endurance. I rested my hand on my glass of water, but didn't drink. At this point, I said very slowly, I am one of the senior executives of that corporation. The words dropped onto the table like a heavy object. Andrew opened his mouth but couldn't speak. Claire froze. Elaine looked at me, her eyes for the first time no longer fully controlled. Thomas narrowed his eyes as if recalculating an equation he'd gotten wrong from the start. I'm not saying this to brag, I added as soon as I saw the shift. I'm saying it because perhaps it's time the truth was placed where it belongs. I looked straight at my son. My income is not a small number. Each month, it's enough to buy the house you're living in within just a few years. Andrew went completely still. I could see it clearly. His shoulders sagged, his eyes empty for several long seconds. I knew that in his mind, an entire past was being rewritten. That's impossible, Thomas blurted out, then fell silent. Elaine took a very deep breath. Claire raised a hand to cover her mouth, her eyes wide. I've earned that much for many years, I said, without emphasis, without avoidance. And I chose to live the way you've seen, not because I couldn't live differently, but because I didn't need to. The balance of the dinner shifted completely. The earlier concern now felt out of place. The offer of a monthly allowance sounded clumsy, almost ridiculous. Andrew looked at me, his voice rough. Mom, why didn't you tell me? I looked at my son for a long moment. Because I wanted you to become the man you are today, not someone who lives off anyone else, me included. Claire turned to look at her parents. I didn't need to read her thoughts to understand. The world had tilted. Elaine said nothing for a while. When she finally spoke, her voice was no longer as soft as before. You hid this. I didn't hide it, I replied gently. I just didn't put it on display. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his earlier confidence gone. We didn't know. I know, I said. And that's why I listened to your offer all the way through. Andrew lowered his head. Claire took a deep breath. No one mentioned money the way they had earlier anymore. The dinner had turned. Not because I raised my voice, not because I was angry, but because my life story, told at the right moment, had exposed another truth. Their initial judgments had been wrong at the root, and I knew that from this moment on, no one at the table would ever be able to look at me the same way again. I didn't speak immediately after finishing my story. Not because I needed to regain my composure, but because I wanted to give them enough time to understand that this dinner no longer belonged to them. Elaine was the first to move. She adjusted her posture, folding her hands together on the table, as if trying to reclaim a sense of control that had just slipped away. Thomas looked at me with an expression completely different from before. No longer the confidence of a man used to deciding, but the caution of someone who had realized he misjudged his opponent. Andrew said nothing. My son looked at me as if seeing a new person, yet wearing the face of the woman who had raised him for decades. In his eyes, I saw confusion mixed with guilt. And Claire. She lowered her head, not out of politeness, but out of shame. I reached into my old fabric bag. That movement made Elaine track every inch of it, her eyes fixed on my hand, as if she feared I might pull out something else that would further overturn the order she knew. I opened the hidden compartment inside the bag, slowly, without haste. Then I placed the black card on the table. I didn't slam it down. I didn't show it off. I simply set it there, directly in front of Elaine. The card lay there, simple, dark, unadorned. But in the world of people like her, it didn't need to say much. It said everything. The air seemed to freeze. Elaine stared at the card for a long time. I saw the exact moment she realized every assumption she'd made had completely collapsed. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat moving slightly. Andrew sucked in a sharp breath. Claire covered her face, then lowered her hand as if unsure what to do with her emotions. "I'd like to be very clear about one thing," I said, calmly but firmly. "I don't need any allowance." Elaine looked up. "Margaret, that's not what I meant." "I know what you meant," I cut in, not raising my voice, "and that's exactly why I'm refusing." I looked straight at her, not because the amount is small, but because what you offered isn't help, it's a transaction. Thomas frowned. "That wasn't our intention." "Yes, it was," I said evenly. "You just didn't call it by its real name." I gently turned the black card with my fingertip, not to show off, but to make it clear I understood this game very well. You use money to buy peace of mind, to buy distance, to manage things that make you uncomfortable. Elaine opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time that evening, she couldn't find the right words. "I don't blame you for being wealthy," I continued, "and I don't blame you for being used to solving problems with money, but I do blame you for seeing me as a problem that needed to be handled." I turned to Thomas. "You talked about old age, about financial burdens, but you never once asked what I needed. You just assumed." Then I turned back to Elaine. "Your concern, your compliments that sounded kind, they all served one purpose, to place me lower so you could feel like you were the ones giving." Elaine's face reddened, not with anger, but with exposure. "I played the role you thought I was," I said slowly. "A simple woman, someone not used to places like this, someone who should be grateful just to be invited to the table." Andrew lowered his head. I saw his shoulders tremble slightly. "And you treated me exactly the way you treat people you believe are beneath you," I said. "Not rudely, not directly, but enough to make them understand their place." Claire looked up, her eyes red. I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice shaking. "I shouldn't have stayed silent." I looked at Claire. In her eyes was real shame, not about money, but about behavior. I nodded slightly. "That's enough for me to hear." Elaine and Thomas remained silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because anything they said now would be too late. I signaled the waiter. He stepped over, his eyes flicking briefly to the black card on the table, then immediately becoming far more serious. "I'll take the check," I said. Thomas startled. "That's not necessary. We invited—" "I know," I smiled, "but tonight I'm treating." The waiter nodded, took the card, and walked away. No one spoke while we waited. The silence now wasn't heavy with tension, but with everyone having to recalibrate their understanding. When the waiter returned, he placed the bill in front of me. The number was clear, undisguised. I didn't look closely. I signed, slipped the card back into my old fabric bag, the same bag that hours earlier had been judged unfit for this place. Andrew looked at the number, then at me. I could see the moment he understood. The monthly allowance they'd offered earlier was, in reality, a very small figure. I stood up, not hurried, not angry. I stood the way I had stood in many important moments of my life, with my back straight and my head held high. "I hope," I said, looking at Elaine and Thomas, "that if you continue to use money to define people, you'll at least be more careful." I turned to Andrew. My son stood as well, his eyes wet. "Mom," he said, but I placed my hand over his, signaling that I understood. "We'll talk tonight," I told him, "but not here." Finally, I looked at Claire. "You still have plenty of time to become the person you want to be. Don't let your silence hurt others." Claire nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. I turned and walked out of the restaurant. The warm lights behind me no longer made me feel small. I walked in my old dress, worn shoes, faded fabric bag, but every step was steady. I left with everything I had brought to the dinner. Not money, not status, but dignity, intact. I arrived back at my apartment when the city lights were fully on. The familiar hallway was quiet enough that I could hear my own footsteps. Dawn was still at the desk, looking up to greet me with the same kind smile as every evening. "Have a good night, Miss Lawson." "Have a peaceful night," I replied, my voice lighter than I expected. When the apartment door closed behind me, I stood still for a long moment, not because I was tired, but because I needed a few minutes to fully feel what had just happened. There was no victory and no bitterness, just a strange sense of relief, as if I'd finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for far too long. I changed out of my dress, poured myself a cup of hot tea, and sat in my familiar chair by the window. The city outside continued to move, countless other stories unfolding in parallel, unaware that at a luxurious restaurant not far away, an order once thought unshakable had been quietly disturbed. My phone vibrated. Andrew's name appeared on the screen. I looked at it for a few seconds before answering. "Mom!" My son's voice came through, hoarse and rushed, as if he'd been running for a long time. "Did you make it home?" "I did," I replied. "Are you okay?" On the other end, Andrew was silent for a few beats. I heard him exhale heavily. I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," I said gently. "Listening is fine." "Mom," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, "I'm sorry." Those two words came late, but they weren't meaningless. "Sorry for what?" I asked, not to pressure him, but to let him face it himself. "For letting it happen," Andrew said quickly, as if afraid he'd lose his courage if he slowed down. "For introducing you like you were something that needed explaining. For staying silent when they said things they shouldn't have." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Andrew," I said, "I'm not angry with you, but I'm angry with myself," he replied. "I didn't see it. I thought I was doing the right thing." "You're living in a world where things like that are considered normal," I said. "I understand. But I don't want to keep living like that," Andrew said, his voice firmer now. Tonight made me rethink a lot. I didn't answer right away. I let my son continue, let him give shape to the thoughts tumbling in his head. "I realized," Andrew said more slowly, "that a lot of what I've had over the past few years didn't come entirely from me, the contracts, the opportunities, the doors that opened too easily." I opened my eyes and looked out the window. "And how does that make you feel?" "It feels like I'm standing on ground I didn't build myself," he replied. "And tonight, I don't want to stand there anymore." I heard something new in my son's voice, a new clarity, not impulsive, not blind rebellion, but a resolve that was taking shape. "Have you talked to Claire yet?" I asked. Andrew sighed. "She left our place a little while ago. She cried a lot." Not long after that, my phone vibrated again. This time, it was Claire. I answered right away. "Aunt Margaret," Claire said, her voice trembling but clear. I'm sorry." "You've already said that," I replied, "and I heard you." "But I need to say more," Claire said. "I stayed silent when I shouldn't have. I let my parents shape everything, and I didn't dare stand up." "You were afraid," I said, not as a question. "Yes," Claire admitted. "I was afraid of losing their support, afraid of disappointing them. But tonight, when you stood up and said those things, I realized I was more disappointed in myself. I listened. I didn't rush to comfort her, because sometimes what someone needs most isn't reassurance, but the space to face their own emotions. Andrew told me, Claire continued, that he wants to walk his own path, not rely on my father anymore. I stayed silent, letting her go on. I know that will start a big fight, Claire said, her voice lowering. My father. He was very angry. I could picture it clearly. Thomas Bennett wasn't a man accustomed to losing control. To him, Andrew's independence wasn't a personal choice. It was a rejection of influence, and that was the hardest thing for him to accept. And Elaine? I asked. Claire hesitated. My mother. She hasn't said much, but I can see she's worried. Not worried about me, worried about losing her grip on things. I nodded, though Claire couldn't see it. Elaine Bennett was used to arranging other people's lives with gentle words and well-timed support. When that tool stopped working, fear followed. I don't know where this is going, Claire said, but I don't want to go back to how things were. No one knows, I replied, but you've started by looking the truth in the eye. That matters. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. The aftershocks of that dinner were spreading outward, like ripples on water. Andrew began re-examining his career path, not with pure pride anymore, but with honesty. He told me later that he had turned down a new project Thomas had introduced him to. No argument, just a clear refusal. Thomas reacted harshly. Andrew recounted it, his voice tired but steady. He said I was ungrateful, that I was destroying my own future. And what do you think? I asked. I think, Andrew replied, that if that future requires me to bow to things I don't believe in, then maybe it's not the future I want. Elaine, according to Claire, began calling more often. No concrete offers anymore, just roundabout questions, reminders about family, about stability. But behind them was a clear fear, losing control over her daughter and son-in-law. I didn't intervene, not because I didn't care, but because I knew that if I stepped in too early, every change would be blamed on me. Andrew and Claire needed to stand on their own decisions, to face the conflicts forming around them themselves. I watched from a distance. I listened when Andrew called, when he was confused, when he doubted himself. I listened when Claire talked about the growing tension in her family. I didn't give instructions. I only asked questions, just enough for them to find their own answers. The Bennett family began to crack, not because I spoke the truth, but because that truth exposed fractures that had always been there, merely hidden beneath money and power. And I knew this was only the beginning of a long process. But sometimes all it takes is one dinner and one person willing to stand up with dignity for things to never return to the way they were. 3 days after that dinner, as I was organizing some old files on my desk at home, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. I was about to ignore it, but instinct made me answer. Margaret? Elaine Bennett's voice came through, lower than I'd ever heard it. May I see you? I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window where the late afternoon sunlight was sliding slowly across familiar rooftops. I knew this call would come sooner or later. I just didn't know how. Where? I asked. Elaine paused briefly. At the Fairmont, the afternoon tea lounge downstairs, if that feels appropriate. I understood the choice. A refined setting. Her familiar territory. A place where Elaine wouldn't feel completely off balance. All right, I said, 11 a.m. When I arrived at the Fairmont, the grand lobby still held its familiar elegance. Polished marble floors, high-hanging chandeliers, a faint trace of perfume in the air. I wore something simple but neat, not the old dress and not clothing that made others wary. Just me, plainly. Elaine was already there. She had chosen a table in the corner where she could see the room but still have privacy. When she saw me, she stood up, not rushed, not stiff, just proper. This time, without judgment. "Thank you for coming," Elaine said. "I wanted to hear what you had to say," I replied. We sat down. Tea was brought over. Elaine ordered her usual black tea. I ordered herbal tea. A small detail, but I noticed Elaine's eyes pause there briefly, as if she were wondering how many things she'd missed by always seeing people through fixed frames. "That dinner," Elaine began, then stopped. She took a deep breath. "I was very shocked." "I know," I said. "Not only by the truth about you," Elaine continued, her voice slower now, "but by the way I realized I had behaved. I was ashamed." The word didn't come easily. I could see it in the way she gripped her teacup. "All my life," Elaine said, "I was taught that status is everything. My father always said, if you're not standing above others, they'll step on you. There's no middle ground." She looked off into the distance, as if seeing some old, closed-off room in her memory. "I grew up at dinners where adults didn't talk about people, only about their value, where they lived, who knew whom, who owed whom." I didn't interrupt. "From a young age, I learned to observe," Elaine said, "not to understand, but to classify, and I carried that habit into adulthood without realizing it." She looked back at me. "When I met you, I did what I knew best." I nodded. "You judged." "Yes," Elaine admitted, "and I was wrong." The air between us was tense, but not hostile, like two people standing before a large mirror, forced to look at the parts they usually avoid. "There's something that unsettles me even more," Elaine went on, her voice dropping, "when I realized I was jealous of you. I was slightly surprised, but I didn't show it. Not because of money," Elaine said quickly, as if afraid I'd misunderstand, "but because of freedom. You don't need anyone's approval. You don't need to show off. You walked into that room, and even though I thought I was above you, in reality, you were the only one who wasn't bound." She gave a thin smile. "I've been bound my whole life without realizing it." I set my teacup down. "Money," I said, "is just a tool. It can build bridges. It can also build walls. The issue isn't the amount, but the purpose people use it for." Elaine listened without interrupting. "I've never used money to control others," I continued, "not because I'm noble, but because I know how heavy it feels to be controlled." Elaine closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her gaze had changed, not as sharp as before, but something more weary. "I thought I was protecting my daughter," she said, "but maybe I was just protecting my own position." "That's not an easy realization," I replied. Elaine fell silent. After a moment, she spoke very slowly. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you." The apology wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth. It carried hesitation, the tension between real regret and the habit of saving face, but I didn't dismiss it. "I hear you," I said, "but I'm not ready to say everything is fine." Elaine nodded without the defensiveness she'd shown before. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness right away." "Forgiveness," I said, "isn't something that can be demanded. It comes after change." Elaine looked up. "And do you believe I can change?" I looked at her for a long time. The woman in front of me was still Elaine Bennett, elegant, wealthy, used to control. But somewhere in her eyes was a small crack, and sometimes that's where light gets in. "I believe," I said slowly, "that anyone can change. but not everyone is willing to pay the cost. Elaine took a deep breath. I don't want to lose my daughter. I know, I said, and that may be motivation enough. We sat a while longer. We didn't talk about Andrew. We didn't talk about Claire. We talked about very human things, about the fear of aging, about letting go, about realizing you've lived too long by other people's expectations. When we stood to leave, Elaine looked at me. Thank you for meeting me. I didn't meet you to help you, I said. I meant you to tell the truth. She nodded. Maybe that's the greatest help. We parted in the hotel lobby. I stepped outside and took in a breath of cool air. I didn't know how much Elaine would change. I wasn't sure where this conversation would lead, but I knew one thing. I hadn't closed the door. Not with hurried forgiveness, but by leaving enough space for change, if it came, to enter. Change didn't arrive all at once, and it wasn't loud. It came slowly, bit by bit, like an old room gradually brightening as someone opens windows that have been shut for too long. Andrew changed the most. A week after my meeting with Elaine, my son called me, his voice far calmer than it had been in those early days of confusion. Mom, he said, I turned down the financial support package from Claire's family. I wasn't surprised, but I stayed silent, letting him continue. They said it was only temporary, Andrew told me, that I didn't need to do this, that everyone benefited. But I realized, if I accepted it, then none of my future decisions would really be mine anymore. And how do you feel? I asked. Light, he replied without hesitation. Lighter than I expected. The decision hadn't been easy. Andrew told me about the tense conversation with Thomas. He hadn't yelled or slammed the table, but every word carried carefully wrapped disappointment. He said I was throwing away a prepared future. Andrew said that there are people who spend their whole lives never getting a chance to stand where I stood. And what did you say? I asked. I told him, Andrew replied slowly, that if that future requires me to keep bowing my head to preserve it, then maybe it isn't a future I want to live. Thomas wasn't used to answers like that. From that moment on, his influence began to fade, not because Andrew rebelled, but because Andrew no longer needed his approval. And for people like Thomas, nothing renders them more powerless than losing their central role in someone else's decisions. Andrew started over in a new job, not glamorous, not a salary that made people marvel, a lower position than what he'd once been promised, but one he earned with his own ability. On his first day, Andrew sent me a very short message. I'm tired today, but I feel like I'm standing upright. I smiled when I read it. Claire changed, too, in a quieter way. She didn't make grand declarations. She didn't cut ties completely with her family, but small habits began to shift. Claire told me, during a long afternoon conversation, that she had sold the expensive car her parents had given her and replaced it with a simpler one. Not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to feel more clearly the value of the things she earned herself. I realized, Claire said, that until now I've never really had to think carefully about how I spend money, and that has made me disconnected from real life. She started cooking more. Meals were no longer about ordering from upscale restaurants, but simple dinners, sometimes just soup and bread. Andrew told me that during those meals they talked more, not about big plans, not about opportunities or connections, but about very ordinary things. Elaine, just as I had expected, changed the slowest. She didn't give up her controlling habits overnight, but she began to learn how to pause. Instead of giving advice that wasn't asked for, she asked questions. Instead of arranging things, she listened. Sometimes she simply listened in silence, something she had rarely done before. Claire told me that once Elaine called just to ask, "Are you okay?" and then waited quietly for the answer without adding any reminders afterward. For someone like Elaine, that was a significant step. Thomas was different. He wasn't used to losing influence, not used to having words that once carried weight reduced to mere opinions. He appeared less often in family conversations. When he did show up, he was usually quiet or spoke in short sentences, no longer with the enthusiasm he once had. There were family meals Andrew described where Thomas barely mentioned work, real estate, or powerful acquaintances. Not because he had completely changed, but because no one wanted to listen to those stories anymore. Those meals, according to Claire, felt strange but easy to breathe in. No more showing off. No more half-joking comments about money. Just people sitting at the same table, eating the same food, speaking to one another in their real voices. I didn't appear often at those gatherings, not because I was excluded, but because I chose to keep my distance. I didn't want my presence to become a shadow that made them change because of me, instead of because of themselves. I watched from afar, through phone calls, messages, and stories told back to me. I saw Andrew learn to say no without apologizing. I saw Claire learn to ask questions instead of automatically accepting things. I saw Elaine sometimes confused, but not returning to her old ways. And I saw Thomas gradually being forced to face the truth that power doesn't last forever if it isn't built on respect. The family began to speak honestly with one another, not always gently. There were tense conversations, tears, long silences, but they were real conversations, no longer covered up by gifts or financial support. Respect in that way was rebuilt, not based on who had more money, but on who dared to live according to their own values. And me, I didn't take revenge. I didn't use my truth to overpower anyone. I didn't use money to reverse roles. I didn't step into that family as a winner. I stepped back, letting go of power I fully could have used, because I learned very early on that real power doesn't lie in controlling others, but in not needing to do so. Letting go isn't weakness. Letting go is trusting that others can grow on their own if they are given the space. And in that slow change, I realized something. The values that once stood highest had been turned upside down, not through punishment, but through truth, patience, and each person choosing again the path they wanted to walk. The news that Andrew was about to become a father reached me on a very quiet afternoon. My son called, his voice unable to hide its tremble, even as he tried to sound calm. He spoke slowly, as if afraid that if he spoke too fast, the moment would slip away. "Mom, Claire is pregnant." I was silent for a few seconds, not because I was surprised, but because a very deep, very warm feeling was spreading through my chest. A circle in my life after so many years seemed about to close in the gentlest way. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I am," Andrew replied. "This time, I really am." I smiled, a smile that didn't need forcing. I knew exactly what those words, "really okay," meant. They weren't just about becoming a father, but about having found solid ground for himself, without dependence, without borrowing, without needing anyone's backing. Since that dinner years ago, there have been no more secrets between Andrew and me. We talk to each other like two adults, not with one-sided protection and not with silent gaps. Andrew asks me about my work, about decisions I made in the past. I ask him about his current worries, about the fear of becoming a father, about the pressure of carrying responsibility on his own shoulders. Some evenings we simply sit on the balcony of my small apartment, drinking tea, watching the city lights come on, No one has to prove anything. No one has to play a role. Once, as I was reorganizing my closet, Andrew happened to notice the old gray dress hanging in the far corner. "You still keep it?" he asked. I nodded. That dress is still there. Faded. Ordinary. No longer worn. But I didn't throw it away, not because of attachment, but because it is a marker. A very personal reminder that one evening I walked into a room looking like the person everyone underestimated the most and walked out with my dignity completely intact. I don't keep that dress because of pain. I keep it because of clarity. The years that followed passed more gently than I ever expected. Elaine didn't become a different person overnight, but she learned how to step back. No more arranging, no more deciding for others. There were moments when she still fumbled, still wanted to intervene, but then she stopped. Something she had never done before. Thomas remained Thomas, but his power was no longer the center of every conversation. He learned to be silent more often, even if not always willingly. And sometimes, silence itself is a lesson. Claire changed the most in ways that surprised me. She didn't try to prove she was simple or different. She just lived more honestly, asked more honestly, and dared to say no to things that had once been considered obvious. I stood at the edge of all those changes, not leading, not controlling, not needing recognition. I simply observed with the calm of someone who understands that if something is true, it will stand on its own without anyone holding it up. Some mornings, I wake up very early, make coffee, and sit alone in my small kitchen. I think about the journey I've taken, from a poor young woman to an exhausted single mother, to a woman studying at night under dim light, to a woman sitting in a luxury restaurant without needing to prove who she is. I came to understand one thing. Sometimes the truth needs to be tested, not to hurt others, but to see who truly deserves to stand beside you when all the layers fall away. Wealth, in the end, has never been about the numbers in a bank account. Wealth lies in freedom, the freedom not to bow your head in exchange for acceptance. Wealth lies in dignity, something no one can buy and no one can take away unless you allow it. Now I live true to myself. I don't need to walk into any room to prove my worth. I don't need my title spoken before my words are heard. I don't need money to create distance, and I don't need simplicity to hide strength. I only need to be myself. A mother, a woman about to become a grandmother. Someone who has gone far enough to understand that the greatest wealth in life isn't what you own, but what you don't lose along the way. And if you've stayed with me until these final lines, perhaps somewhere in my story, you've seen a part of yourself. In the silence, in the hard choices, in the desire to be respected for who you truly are. If you'd like, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching this story from. Have you ever been in a moment where your value was misjudged? I would truly love to read your story. If this story touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me for the stories to come. Thank you, truly, for giving your time, your attention, and your heart to this story.